Kierkegaard's relations to Hegel reconsidered. Subjective and objective thinking. Hegel in the concluding unscientific postscript. John Stewart. Kierkegaard published the concluding unscientific postscript on February 28, 1846, and many individual bits of evidence indicate that it is a crucial text in his literary corpus as a whole. It was of course the companion volume to the Philosophical Fragments and was therefore published under the same pseudonym, Johannes Climacus. Moreover, the postscript represents one of the most comprehensive statements of his mature views. Not only do earlier ideas and their full expression there, but outlines of a number of views developed later can also be discerned. The postscript is one of the most philosophical texts authored by Kierkegaard and has been regarded by some commentators as the origin of the existential tradition of European philosophy. All of this has made it one of his most read works and one of the most important for the reception of his thought in general. In reviewing his authorship as a whole, Kierkegaard himself reserves a special place for the postscript, designating it the turning point in his literary work. One in his own account of his literary career in the point of view for my work as an author, he explains his general publication plan and the unique role of the postscript therein. There he omits his early book review, From the Papers of One Still Living, and his dissertation, The Concept of Irony, and declares that his authorship began in 1843 with either/or. This work initiates the series of pseudonymous books that lead up to the postscript in 1846. 2. In the postscript itself, in the section A Glance at a Contemporary Effort in Danish Literature, Johannes Climacus characterizes these works as aesthetic. In the point of view for my work as an author and on my work as an author, Kierkegaard indicates that he intentionally published, parallel to these pseudonymous works, a series of religious writings, the various upbuilding or edifying discourses. There were thus two parallel authorships, one religious and one aesthetic. The postscript is particularly important since it brings together the parallel authorships. Kierkegaard writes, the RST division of books is aesthetic writing, the last division of books is exclusively religious writing. Between these lies the concluding unscientific postscript as the turning point. 3. Although the postscript also has a pseudonym, i.e., Johannes Climacus, Kierkegaard adds a first and last explanation on unnumbered pages at the end of the work in which he reveals that he is the author of the various pseudonymous works, including the postscript itself. This work is therefore in a sense both pseudonymous and signed. Moreover, it unites the two parts of the authorship. Kierkegaard refers to this publication strategy as a comprehensive plan in the entire production. For a word of caution about this plan must be given since, as has been noted previously, 5. There is evidence that Kierkegaard's decision to publish some of the works pseudonymously was not carefully planned but rather only decided at the last minute and on the spur of the moment. Moreover, it would be a mistake to insist on a hard and fast distinction between the edifying authorship and the pseudonymous works since, as recent authors have pointed out, they have much in common with respect to both content and form. The explanation for this elaborate publication scheme lies in Kierkegaard's biography. He seems to have been obsessed with the idea that he would die, as Christ did, at the age of 33. 6. Apparently, sometime after his dissertation he thus conceived of the plan for a parallel authorship that would be completed before he reached the age of 34. He planned for the postscript to be his null book according to this scheme, being certain that he would die afterwards. In this sense the word concluding in the title refers to the work not just as a conclusion to the Philosophical Fragments but also as the termination of Kierkegaard's activity as an author generally. Thus, it seems that in the postscript Kierkegaard was at some level trying to settle old scores and to present a null or culminating picture of his views. 7. Another biographical reason for the notion that the postscript was to be his null work was that Kierkegaard intended to give up writing altogether and become a country priest. In February 1846, just a few weeks before the appearance of the postscript, he writes, "It is now my intention to qualify as a pastor. For several months I have been praying to God to keep on helping me. For it has been clear to me for some time now that I ought not to be a writer any longer, something I can only be totally or not at all. This is the reason I have not started anything new along with proof correcting except for the little review of 2 Ages, which again is concluding. 8. Kierkegaard did, of course, continue his literary production after the postscript. However, the character of the works after 1846 is different, with the religious writings assuming the central role that the pseudonymous writings had enjoyed before. Corresponding to this turning point in Kierkegaard's published works is a shift in focus in his journals and papers. Prior the postscript, the entries in the journals are a mixture of reactions on various subjects, lecture notes, reading notes, drafts of works in progress, but after 1846 the journals take on a different character. After the postscript, the entries are more self-referential in the sense that Kierkegaard attempts repeatedly to explain himself and his literary production. The journals take on the aspect of an apologia pro mea vita. Given these various factors, both biographical and literary, the importance of the role of the postscript as a pivotal work for Kierkegaard's literary enterprise as a whole can hardly be overestimated. Not only was the postscript the turning point in Kierkegaard's authorship generally, but it was also an important turning point in his relation to Hegel. From the very RST publications, from the papers of one still living and the concept of irony, through the pseudonymous works up to the postscript, there had been a steady dialogue with Hegelian philosophy. Sometimes sympathetic and sometimes hostile, the dialogue clearly was important to Kierkegaard's intellectual agenda. The previous discussions come to a head in the postscript, where Hegel's philosophy seems to be made one of the main objects of discussion and criticism. After the postscript, Kierkegaard, for whatever reason, makes his peace with Hegelianism. After 1846 there are almost no references to it in either Kierkegaard's published works or the journals, and thus it apparently ceases to be an issue for him after this time. Once again many factors point to the postscript as the decisive work for this shift. The postscript constitutes a crucial text in the present investigation, since it is generally perceived as Kierkegaard's most extended criticism of Hegelianism. The very title of the book as unscientific seems to be intended as an ironic reference to Hegel's conception of philosophy as a system. Here terms such as the system, the method, speculative philosophy, and the objective view, all seem to stand for Hegel and Hegelianism. In the body of the text, Johannes Climacus opposes to these terms what he considers fundamentally Christian categories. While speculative philosophy makes use of direct communication, Christianity uses indirect communication. While the individual is objectively related to the objects of speculative philosophy, the Christian believer is subjectively related to his or her belief. While speculative philosophy is attractive and seductive, Christianity represents something repellent, an offense. While speculative philosophy is passionless, Christianity represents innate pathos and passion. While the speculative thinker abstracts from himself in order to gain a speculative perspective, the Christian concentrates as much as possible on himself as an existing individual subject. Thus, Christianity is presented as the antipode of speculative philosophy, and the two positions are in a sense carved out in relation to one another. Despite all this, I will argue that the standard interpretation of the postscript as a polemic with Hegel is, generally speaking, a misunderstanding. When one examines the text carefully, one nds that although a great deal of it purports to be about Hegel, little of Hegel's actual thought is present. The picture of Hegel presented here is not one based on his primary texts, but is rather simply a position, in many ways arbitrary, which Kierkegaard has Climacus use as a contrast to his own view. In this sense, the Hegel of the postscript has more to do with Kierkegaard than with the actual thought or writings of the German philosopher himself. I wish to argue that the polemic here is in fact primarily with Martensen 9 and Heiberg, who stood for a certain picture of Hegelianism in Kierkegaard's eyes. This becomes clear when one examines a number of veiled terms and expressions, which Johannes Climacus uses to refer to these Danish Hegelians in the text. In this chapter, I will claim, contrary to the standard view, that Hegel's presence in the postscript is at best second-hand. Although there is a fair amount of repetition in the text, A commentary on virtually the entire work would be required in order to extract all of the purported criticisms of Hegelian doctrines. Since I cannot provide a systematic commentary of this kind in the present study, I have endeavored to isolate the most important criticisms that have then been treated individually. In this chapter I will analyze specific, frequently used, terms and expressions, which I refer to as Kierkegaard's code, since, as in other works, he identifies the contemporary targets of his various criticisms in the work by means of such encoded expressions. In the next section I will turn to Climacus' account of the speculative point of view 10, in which he argues for the absurdity of basing faith on speculative philosophy. In section 3, I will treat Climacus' claim that speculative philosophy eliminates the paradox of Christianity by explaining it. 11. Section 4 continues this discussion by treating Climacus' criticism that speculative philosophy reduces Christianity to a night form of knowing. 12. The next section treats the frequently recurring criticism that the speculative philosopher tends to forget his own existence in his abstract thought. 13. In section 6, I will examine Climacus' criticism of speculative philosophy for the claim to make a presuppositionless beginning. 14. In the next section I will examine the ethically misguided desire to become a world historical individual which, Climacus claims, speculative philosophy promotes. 15. Then in section 8, I will turn to Climacus' criticism of the thesis of the unity of being and thought that lies at the foundation of Hegel's philosophy. 16. Next, I will return to the discussion of the law of excluded middle. 17. Which has been explored in previous chapters in the context of other works. 18. Finally, I will examine Climacus' charge, which appears in a number of scattered passages throughout the text, that Hegel's system has no ethics. The true targets of the postscript. It is understandable that in the history of interpretation, the postscript has been generally regarded as Kierkegaard's great polemic against Hegel, if only due to the number of times key terms from Hegelian philosophy, such as the system, the method, world history, and mediation, appear in the text. But a number of factors should make one wary of this interpretation. First, the heyday of Hegelianism in Denmark reached its climax around the time of Kierkegaard's dissertation in 1841 and was over in 1846 when the postscript appeared. 19. In a footnote in the work itself, Climacus refers to Poul Martin Mahler's relation to Hegel. 20. He writes, "When everything here at home was Hegelian, Mahler judged quite differently." 21. The period referred to is presumably 1837 when Mahler published his essay Thoughts on the Possibility of Proofs of Human Immortality, in which he distanced himself from Hegel's philosophy. 22. The time in question can hardly be later than this since Mahler died a year later in 1838. Thus, it is no surprise that Climacus uses the past tense, thus indicating that the period during which everything in Denmark was Hegelian was over at the time when he was writing this work. If Hegelianism was no longer a decisive trend in Danish intellectual life, why would Kierkegaard feel the need to criticize it at this point, and why not earlier when it was more vital? Moreover, it is hard to overlook the bitter personal tone of Climacus' attack, which is difficult to explain merely by a difference of philosophical viewpoints. Hegel and his followers are accused of being dishonest, presumptuous, immoral, and absent-minded, having no sense of humor, playing tricks, deceiving the youth, and so on. Kierkegaard had offered criticisms of Hegel in the past, but they rarely had the tone of personal accusations. What is different about the postscript? Why did this ad hominem tone suddenly appear? When one reads the ostensible polemic against Hegel in the postscript, one is surprised to find that there are virtually no quotations from Hegel's primary texts, no textual analyses, and when Hegel's name does come up, it is usually incidental and not in the context of any substantive discussion of his thought. Instead, certain key terms or concepts like the ones listed previously are presented, which are generally intended to stand for Hegelianism or some picture of it. As has been indicated, I would like to argue that the postscript is primarily concerned not so much with Hegel himself but rather with Kierkegaard's old enemies Martensen and, perhaps to a lesser degree, Heiberg, two of the chief exponents of Danish Hegelianism. The claim that the postscript is intended in large part as a hidden polemic against Martensen is supported by a number of scattered pieces of evidence. In his journals, Kierkegaard reeks on a controversy between Martensen and a student of theology, Magnus Eirksen I, 1806-81. The latter, who was familiar with Kierkegaard's code, rightly saw in the postscript a criticism of Martensen, but in an unpublished response Kierkegaard says ironically that in the whole book no student can have found a word about Professor Martensen. 23. This suggests that Kierkegaard intentionally avoided mentioning actual names in his text and instead engaged in indirect or veiled criticism as he did in most of the other works examined so far. In his autobiography from years later, Martensen reeks on Kierkegaard's animosity. In a very telling fashion, he writes of Kierkegaard, "He sought to annihilate and extinguish every bit of activity that emanated from me. He did not attack me directly at all. He never attacked me in straightforward and open battle." 24 years later, in his attack on the Church, Kierkegaard himself says more or less the same thing when reacting back on this period: "Bishop Martensen and I are not, as they say, entirely unacquainted with each other. For many years there has been, literally, an unsettled account between us. But as long as the old bishop, who for better or for worse was such a friend of calmness, was living, also out of devotion to my late father, I took care from my side that it could go on quietly. I refused to attack him by name, and Bishop Martensen maintained silence." 25. Here Kierkegaard says straightforwardly that he criticized Martensen covertly through the pseudonyms and other means, and that he intentionally made an effort to veil these criticisms out of respect both for his father, presumably to avoid a scandal, and for Bishop Münster, who was on good terms with Martensen. In a journal entry, Kierkegaard reeks on the criticisms of Martensen that he presented through the years under the various pseudonyms. He notes explicitly, the pseudonyms always made only an indirect attack. 26. Although these criticisms were veiled, contemporary readers had no difficulty recognizing Martensen as their target. Years later, in the context of the attack on the Church, Kierkegaard writes, "Even when the person who for Bishop Martensen certainly must be regarded as the most dangerous person to say it, even when Professor Nielsen in print gave him to understand that my pseudonym had disposed of him, which then for him the most dangerous person, next to Professor Nielsen, to say it, Dr. Stilling, again in print gave him to understand, and which later was quite bluntly said to him in print, Bishop Martensen maintained silence." 27. Here Kierkegaard refers to Rasmus Nielsen's joint review of the postscript and Martensen's Christian Dogmatics, 1849, 28, in which Nielsen shows the former to be a criticism of precisely the kind of objective thinking contained in the latter. Kierkegaard's response to this review was that Nielsen had been too direct in his criticism of Martensen. 29. He felt so strongly about this that it caused a falling out between Kierkegaard and Nielsen after a period when the two men were on quite good terms. There is evidence in Kierkegaard's journals that he was exercised by Martensen's dogmatics and planned a response to the work that he never published, presumably because the polemic would have had to be too direct. 30. The second reference in the passage quoted previously is an allusion to a work by the Hegelian Peter Michael Stilling, which was also critical of Martensen's dogmatics. 31. These allusions make it clear that readers such as Nielsen and Stilling could see in the postscript the polemic against Martensen, although Kierkegaard took care not to name the target of his criticism directly. One of the ways in which Kierkegaard covertly criticized Martensen was via what seemed to be a criticism of Hegel. That this criticism was carried out under the egg of a critique of Hegel was also noted by Kierkegaard's contemporaries. In his article on Danish Hegelianism, Hans Friedrich Hellwig writes, later, as is well known, Kierkegaard's protest against Hegel through the pseudonyms became an ever sharper attack on Martensen. 32. Here Hellwig says that it is well known, i.e., that it is obvious to the contemporary reader. Martensen himself clearly recognizes this as well when he writes, his Kierkegaard's writings of course contained all sorts of polemical and satirical attacks on speculation, a portion of which was directed at me. 33 During the years before the publication of the postscript, Kierkegaard's enmity for Martensen reached new heights. There are a number of personal reasons that can explain his animosity. While Kierkegaard was passed over for academic posts, Martensen was appointed to the Royal Danish Society of Scholars in 1841 and in the same year received the position of Professor Extraordinarius and later in 1850 the position of Ordinarius. 34 In short, Kierkegaard was embittered about the lack of recognition that he received, while his rival was showered with praise. Martensen explains their relation thus, in the beginning his SC. Kierkegaard's relation to me had been friendly, but it assumed an increasingly hostile character. He was moved to this in part by the differences in our views and in part by the recognition I enjoyed from the students and the public, a recognition which he clearly viewed, nor did he attempt to conceal it, as an unjust overestimation. 35 Particularly bitter for Kierkegaard was the fact that Martensen was appointed to the coveted position of Official Court Priest in 1845. As clear from Kierkegaard's journals and papers, this is something that exercised him considerably. 36 Martensen obtained this position with the help of Bishop Münster, who some 10 years earlier had been involved in polemics with the Hegelians and even with Martensen himself. This turn of events embittered Kierkegaard even more towards both Martensen and Münster, and it took place at precisely the time when he was writing the postscript. But while there was, to be sure, an ad hominem element in Kierkegaard's polemic with Martensen, there was also a serious theological point, which cannot be explained in purely biographical or psychological terms. Kierkegaard saw in the Guru of Martensen, who began as a university professor and became a priest, an inappropriate and indeed unholy mixture of secular philosophy and Christianity. To his mind, this mixture compromises and corrupts the true nature of Christian faith. 37. This is also an essential part of Kierkegaard's criticism of Adler. Kierkegaard was convinced that Martensen lacked the inwardness and subjective character to be a priest and a spokesman for Christianity. Although Martensen's name does not appear in the text of the postscript itself, it does appear in drafts, both alone and along with the names of other Hegelians. 38. The direct references to Martensen himself were later changed and replaced by more anonymous formulations, such as a Hegelian. Moreover, Kierkegaard refers to Martensen several times in his later comments about the postscript. 39. For these reasons Martensen makes a much better candidate than Hegel as the true, albeit veiled, target of the postscript. Further, when one examines closely the key terms, which Kierkegaard repeats and associates with Hegelianism in this text, one nds that they in fact refer to Martensen and not to Hegel. For example, he repeats again and again the Latin phrase de omnibus dubitandum est. As was explored previously, in 1842-43 Kierkegaard wrote a draft for a short work, which he never published, entitled, Johannes Climacus, or De omnibus dubitandum est. It is the story of a young student of theology who tries to come to terms with the Cartesian principle of universal doubt. As was argued previously, 40 that work was a criticism of Martensen and of what Kierkegaard perceived as the pernicious effect that Martensen's courses had on the students at the University of Copenhagen. The plot of De Omnibus is also represented in the postscript 41 and the slogan De Omnibus dubitandum est appears several times both in Latin and in Danish equivalents. 42 The criticism of Martensen is thinly veiled and would clearly have been recognized by a contemporary reader. There can be little doubt that, here as before, the expression de omnibus dubitandum est is, for Kierkegaard, a catchword for Martensen. 43 Another code word is the system, which has traditionally been understood as referring to Hegel. In his attack on the Church, Kierkegaard directly associated this term with Martensen. He writes, things went on very quietly with regard to the system, in which Bishop Martensen did not draw the longest straw. I refused to attack him by name, and Bishop Martensen maintained silence. 44 Here Kierkegaard indicates that he criticized Martensen under the catchword the system, which has invariably been associated with Hegel in the secondary literature. In a journal entry from 1850, Kierkegaard discusses the attacks of his pseudonymous authors on Martensen. There he writes, addressing Martensen directly. "But you will not deny it, will you, Professor Martensen? You do not want the embarrassment of being the only one in the kingdom to deny that from the very beginning these pseudonyms, in a highly disturbing and annoying manner, have had a bearing on the system. And this whole matter of the system, again, was chiefly linked to your name." 45 Here Kierkegaard declares unambiguously that one of the goals of his pseudonymous writings was to criticize Martensen under the term the system. He continues by listing a series of other names that were associated with the system. 46 In a journal entry from circa 1851, Kierkegaard states the point again directly, home from abroad at the opportune moment with Hegel's philosophy, he Martensen made a big sensation, had extraordinary success, won over the whole student generation to the system. Since he represented the system, I disagreed with Professor Martensen and he with me. 47 Here it seems clear that Martensen is taken to represent a general tendency that is only indirectly related to Hegel. The criticism seems rather to be of those who try to imitate Hegel and the other German philosophers, and who make pretentious claims about their own systems. As has been noted earlier, 48 Kierkegaard was incensed by Martensen's claim to have gone further than Hegel himself. The expression of going further of course appears many times in many different forms in the postscript and in other texts. 49 In the postscript, Johannes Climacus refers to this frequently without mentioning Martensen's name. For example, in his discussion of Trendelenburg's criticism of Hegel's logic, he praises Trendelenburg for avoiding a sycophantic relation to Hegel, which he clearly associated with Martensen. It is by no means my view that Hegelian philosophy has not had a salutary influence on Trendelenburg, but it is fortunate that he has perceived that wanting to improve Hegel's structure, to go further, etc. will not do, a mendacious approach by which many a botcher in our age arrogates Hegel's celebrity to himself and mendicantly fraternizes with him. 50 There can be little doubt that Kierkegaard has Martensen in mind here. He consistently saw Martensen as an unoriginal thinker who gained success merely by attaching himself to Hegel's name and profiting from his fame. I know very well that for a long time now here in Denmark certain people have made themselves important by what they have learned from the Germans and rendered practically word for word, as if it were their own, that they have compiled various diverse German thinkers, professors, assistant professors, tutors, etc. 51 Later in his journals Kierkegaard associates the Gur of the Privatdozent with Martensen. He indicates that the postscript is a rationalized account of systematic philosophy, although it draws inspiration from Spezigers such as Martensen. A part of this was to create a German Gur, the Privatdozent. He indicates in several places that this too was a part of his strategy of hiding his polemic. He states as follows that for this reason he made Germany the rationalized setting. It is poetically appropriate to keep the scene vague, roughly in Germany, recognizable by the Privatdozent. 52 While Kierkegaard insists that Professor Martensen is mentioned nowhere in the book, 53 and that the Gurs criticized articious caricatures, he goes on to associate Martensen with the slogan of going further. 54 In another entry from the same period, Kierkegaard again hints that the Gur of the Privatdozent is supposed to be a caricature of Martensen. Kierkegaard states that he disagreed with Martensen and writes further, "For my part I let the pseudonyms express the disagreement, but in such a softened and blurred fashion that the scene could just as well be in Germany, where at that time the Privatdozent was a stock character, whereas we did not have a single one. Martensen was never named, the whole context was poetically maintained." 55 Here he indicates once again that he employs an indirect strategy and that he intentionally distorts things so as not to make his true target, Martensen, so readily recognizable. Here Kierkegaard confirms what Hellwig said previously, i.e., that the pseudonymous works carried on a polemic with Martensen and not with Hegel. Another code word in the postscript that seems to be associated with Martensen is the Latin phrase sub specie aeterni or sub specie aeternitatis, i.e., under the view of eternity. 56 Climacus uses this phrase several times to describe the aperspectival or absolute perspective of systematic philosophy, which casts its view over all of world history. This phrase is traditionally associated with Spinoza, who employs it as follows in his Ethics. It is in the nature of reason to perceive things in the light of eternity sub quadam specie aeternitatis. 57 In his account of Spinoza in both The Science of Logic and the Lectures on the History of Philosophy, 58 Hegel explains Spinoza's epistemology with reference to this phrase. Spinoza makes the sublime demand of thought that it consider everything under the form of eternity, sub specie aeterni, that is, as it is in the absolute. 59 Martinson appropriates the slogan, just as he did the Cartesian slogan de omnibus dubitandum est. It appears several times in his works, for example, in his dissertation on the autonomy of human self-consciousness, 60 in his review of Heiberg's Fata Morgana, 61 and in his treatise Meister Eckhart. 62 Moreover, it is quoted in Bornemann's review of Martinson's dissertation. 63 Thus, Climacus's frequent use of this Latin expression would presumably remind his readers of Martinson and would serve to identify him as one of the targets of criticism in the discussion where it appeared. Another target of criticism in the postscript is Heiberg, whose name also appears in drafts of the work. 64 Heiberg is ridiculed for his over-enthusiastic account of his conversion to Hegelianism, 65 and for his Unished system. The former is a reference to Heiberg's aforementioned account of his miraculous comprehension of the broad outline of Hegel's system, which he experienced in Hamburg on his return trip from Berlin in 1824. 66 The latter is a reference to Heiberg's The System of Logic, which ended at 23, while promising further installments. 67 The comments here in the postscript are clearly part of Kierkegaard's ongoing polemic with him. The criticism of the uncompleted system could also be a reference to Rasmus Nielsen. Like that of Martinson and Heiberg, Nielsen's name appears in a draft of the postscript. 68 Also like Martinson and Heiberg, Nielsen was one of the leading Danish Hegelians. He worked together with Martinson as a junior professor at the University of Copenhagen. Like Martinson, Nielsen was only a few years older than Kierkegaard, and, as has been noted previously, 69 An animosity developed between the two men early on when Kierkegaard accused Nielsen of being unprepared to assume the professorship at the University of Copenhagen, which he was awarded in 1841. In the years after his appointment, Nielsen, who was apparently quite zealous in his espousal of Hegel, claimed to have already worked out in his head the basic outlines of a speculative system. As was mentioned, 70 Nielsen published the RST part in 1841 under the title, Speculative Logic in its Essentials, in which he offered a subscription plan for the forthcoming parts of the system. 71 On the overleaf of the RST installment he writes, this outline is to be regarded as a fragment of a philosophical methodology, the RST part of which will contain logic with a preliminary introduction. The necessity of having a printed guide for the oral lecture has hastened the publication. The remaining installments will follow eventually as the lecture announced in the catalogue of courses approaches. Copenhagen, the 10th of November 1841. R. Nielsen. 72. Although Nielsen managed to publish 4 installments from 1841 to 1844, the work was never completed. The text simply broke off in medias residential at the end of each number, in anticipation of the next one, which would take it up again. The 4th number from 1844, which proved to be the null one, ends in the middle of a sentence, which served to underscore the incomplete nature of the system. In Kierkegaard's journals Nielsen is constantly ridiculed for his subscription scheme. 73 The works on logic by Heiberg and Nielsen are the uncompleted system that Johannes Climacus criticizes unendingly in the postscript. 74 He writes, when Lessing said these words, the system was presumably not nished, alas, and now he is dead. If he were living now when the system has been completed for the most part or is at least in the works and will be nished by next Sunday, believe me, Lessing would have clutched it with both hands. 75 In an even sharper tone, Climacus, as a prospective convert, tells of his dialogue with the systematic thinker, when I for the last time very innocently said to one of the initiates, "Now tell me honestly, is it the system indeed completely niched, because if that is the case, I will prostrate myself, even if I should ruin a pair of trousers." I would invariably receive the answer, "No, it is not entirely niched yet." 76. These comments are perplexing if taken as a reference to Hegel, since there has never been an issue in Hegel of the system being incomplete. But they make perfect sense in their historical context as references to Heiberg and Nielsen. In an article published in Fäderlandet on June 12, 1842, Kierkegaard states directly that Nielsen is the target of this criticism. It is the system toward which the age is directing its efforts. Professor R. Nielsen already has published 21 logical that constitute the RST part of a logic that in turn constitutes the RST part of an all-encompassing encyclopedia, as intimated on the jacket, although its size is not more explicitly given, presumably not to intimidate, since people certainly will venture to conclude that it will be extremely large. It has often been encouraging to me to think that Professor R. Nielsen is writing such a book. He already has written 21 and several years ago published a subscription prospectus for a systematic ethics that will amount to at least 24 printed sheets when it is niched. 77. Here both elements are clearly present, the subscription prospectus and the incomplete system. It has already been seen that this same criticism was leveled against Heiberg in prefaces. 78. Here while Kierkegaard has nothing but abuse for Hegelians and the attempt to imitate Hegel's logic, he has nothing to say about Hegel himself. It has been noted that Kierkegaard has Martensen in mind in his criticism of the assistant professor or Privatdozent, but there is evidence that this is also intended as a criticism of Martensen's colleague, Nielsen. Kierkegaard uses the Privatdozent to designate a particular type of academic careerist and sophist. In the journals he describes this character type as follows: the Privatdozent is a didacticizing braggart, a lightly armed encyclopedist. He has a slapdash kind of scholarliness, he is neither teacher nor independent thinker. A Privatdozent relates himself superstitiously to the system. The Privatdozent is a halfness, he has the pretentious form of the didacticizing lecturer and has essentially nothing to say, or he has a short rigmarole in which he in turn has joint ownership with every other Privatdozent. The Privatdozent is an utterly fanciful character, he does not accomplish anything, he merely makes wind, especially by means of promises and announcements. Therefore as an author a Privatdozent belongs mainly to subscription prospectus dust jacket literature. 79. This description with its reference to the subscription prospectus seems to refer to Nielsen. Kierkegaard was bitterly envious of Nielsen's academic success. He saw him as an unoriginal and mediocre thinker who merely exploited Hegel's fame to gain professional advancement. Moreover, he regarded him as unrictably deferential to Hegel's philosophy. Kierkegaard frequently uses the expressions the Privatdozent and Herr Professor as terms of derision in this context. With these terms he understands the role of Nielsen and Martensen as professional philosophers or academics, and by so doing contrasts them with his conception of the true philosopher in the Greek sense. This also allows him to contrast them with his view of the true Christian believer. In his later criticism of Martensen in the Attack on the Church, Kierkegaard recalls his previous criticism of him as one of the assistant professors. 80. The null main target of the postscript, who has been little recognized at least in the Anglophone literature, is Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig, 1783–1872. A profoundly influential poet and priest, Grundtvig is regarded as one of the most important figures in Danish culture, although he is hardly known outside Scandinavia. He was a prolific writer and authored many works on history as well as Nordic myths and legends. In his historical works, above all his World Chronicles, 1812, 1814, 1817, 81 and his mammoth handbook on world history, 1833–43, 82 he was interested in determining the place and mission of the Scandinavian people in the development of Christianity. He saw Christianity as being in need of a renewal that could only come from Scandinavia. His history writing was thus a central part of his theology. While Grundtvig was not a Hegelian, his views on history have often been confused with those of Hegel. Kierkegaard's relation to Grundtvig is an interesting one. 83 He carried on a polemic with Grundtvig in many of his published works and in his journals. 84 He had many theological objections to Grundtvig's views, which emphasized history and the religious community and not the individual. The polemic with Grundtvig also took on a personal dimension since Kierkegaard's elder brother, Peter Christian, was a Grundtvigian. In the postscript Grundtvig is named explicitly, and reference is made to his matchless discovery and his doctrine of the living word. 85 The section The Church 86 from Chapter 1 of Part 1 of the work is dedicated to criticizing Grundtvig, whose name also appears several times in drafts of the work. 87 Johannes Climacus criticizes Grundtvig's theory of history in the postscript, which has often been taken as a criticism of Hegel due to the simple fact that Hegel's philosophy of history is today better known than that of Grundtvig. Key terms such as spirit or world history, which have been generally understood as references to Hegel, are in fact code words for Grundtvig. Thus, Grundtvig, along with Martensen, Heiberg, and Nielsen, are, although little recognized, the true targets of criticism in the postscript. When one examines the postscript and above all the purported criticisms of Hegel, one nds that the code words mentioned here come up over and over again. Going further, de omnibus dubitandum est, the privatdocent, the Unisch system, and so on. Commentators have taken many of these terms as straightforward references to Hegel 88 and have thus failed to see them for what they are, namely, code words. The key to understanding Kierkegaard's text is to understand this code and to link up the specific historical personalities with the individual encoded expressions. The important things to note here are, 1. That these code words refer almost invariably to Martensen, Heiberg, Nielsen, and Grundtvig, and not to Hegel, and 2. That for this reason the criticisms often contain an ad hominem element, which must be recognized and purged if they are to be regarded as having philosophical value. When one follows up the references consistently in each of the sections in which Hegel is purportedly criticized, the result is that there is in fact virtually no Hegel left in the text once the references for each of the encoded words and expressions have been identified in the context of the various criticisms. In his journals from some years later, Kierkegaard makes the following very telling entry about how he conceived of the postscript and its relation to Hegel and speculative philosophy. He writes, I regarded the concluding postscript to be, among other things, a Danish protest against modern speculation. I understood, as time will surely bear me out, that when the tyrannical opinion by which the system maintained itself has vanished, my pseudonym will be acknowledged to have been right in his view that it was genuinely Danish to regard the exaggerations of this speculation as comic, yet without forgetting that it is also Danish to love and honor true scholarship, such as Greek scholarship at present, which actually is what the pseudonym uses, although he is also indebted very much to an earlier German scholarship as well as to Hegel. 89. Hier Kierkegaard indicatst hat the polemicent postscript is with certain exaggerations made in the name of speculative philosophy. At RST it sounds as if he understands this as a criticism of Hegel, but then it is clear from the null sentence that he in fact admires Hegel and values his scholarship. Thus, the criticism is not of Hegel himself but of specific Hegelians, who make an inappropriate use of certain aspects of Hegel's thought. I take this to be an important interpretive clue to understanding the postscript. To speculative philosophy and eternal happiness. The RST purported account of Hegel's philosophy comes in the second chapter of Part 1, the speculative point of view, 90, in which speculative philosophy is criticized along with other objective approaches to Christianity. I will argue that Johannes Climacus' criticism here is not of Hegel's philosophy per se but rather of the attempt to base religious faith on speculative thought. An analysis of the code words contained in this chapter makes it obvious that this criticism is aimed primarily at Martensen. In order to understand this criticism, it will be necessary to say a few words about its role in the context of the work as a whole. The postscript begins with an analysis of various approaches to Christianity, which Climacus tries to demonstrate are fundamentally mistaken. His central claim, which is explored in some detail later in the work, is that Christianity is essentially subjective in the sense that it concerns human beings as individuals. Christianity offers the possibility of eternal happiness, which is of interest to one as an individual. In the introduction, Climacus writes, without having comprehended Christianity, I have at least understood this much, that it wants to make the single individual eternally happy, and that precisely within this single individual it presupposes this innate interest in his own happiness as conditio sine qua non. 91. The offer of eternal happiness is of the highest importance to the individual. In Part 1, Climacus examines different approaches to Christianity, which he designates as objective, i.e., those which attempt to gain knowledge of Christianity based on the methods and means available in such academic fields as philology or history. He tries to demonstrate the incommensurability between, on the one hand, the evidence and discursive arguments used to demonstrate the truth of Christianity via scholarly means and, on the other hand, the individual innate interest in eternal happiness which is at stake. When the evidence is examined and the arguments weighed out, Climacus argues, there will always be a gap between, on the one hand, the merely approximative historical knowledge of Christ or philological knowledge of the Bible and, on the other hand, the degree of certainty required to stake one's eternal happiness. With the issue understood in this way, even the best possible evidence and arguments urging the truth of Christianity will be hopelessly inadequate when compared with the risk of losing one's eternal happiness. Speculative philosophy, for Climacus, belongs to this group of mistaken approaches to Christianity since it attempts to see Christianity as an objective historical phenomenon. It must be noted that Climacus has nothing against the fields of philology, history, per se, or even against the knowledge of religion or Christianity that results from them. What he objects to is the use of their results in an attempt to ground faith discursively. The RST thing to note about this initial discussion of speculative philosophy is that it abounds in veiled references to Martinson. In this section, Climacus writes, speculation does everything, it doubts everything, etc. The speculative thinker, on the other hand, has become too objective to talk about himself. Therefore he does not say that he doubts everything but that speculation does it. 92. Although Martinson's Cartesian motto, de omnibus dubitandum est, 93 does not appear here, the image of a speculative thinker employing universal doubt is clearly intended to evoke Martinson. It has been noted that Martinson's claim to have gone beyond Hegel was a never-ending source of criticism for Kierkegaard. 94. Climacus sarcastically addresses the abstract speculative thinker thus, therefore, my precious human being, most honorable Mr. Speculative Thinker, you at least I value to approach in subjective address, O my friend. How do you view Christianity, that is, are you a Christian or are you not? The question is not whether you are going further but whether you are a Christian, unless going further in a speculative thinker's relation to Christianity means. Here Climacus criticizes the speculative thinker for going beyond ceasing to be what one was. 95. Tien belief by subordinating it to a philosophical understanding of the world. There is reason to believe that Martinson or his version of Hegelianism is the real target of Climacus' critique, given the formulation going further. Moreover, when one examines the content of Climacus' criticism here, it becomes more obvious that his target cannot be Hegel's thought per se. For Climacus, speculative philosophy is an objective form of knowing since it approaches Christianity from a historical and conceptual perspective, which is, for him, objective. 96. This approach, according to his view, while correct for scholarship, is incorrect with regard to faith since Christianity itself is subjective, and this subjectivity is characterized by an innate passion and interest in one's eternal happiness. If Christianity is essentially subjectivity, it is a mistake if the observer is objective. In all knowing in which it holds true that the object of cognition is the inwardness of the subjective individual himself, it holds true that the knower must be in that state. But the expression for the utmost exertion of subjectivity is the innately passionate interest in its eternal happiness. 97. While Christians are passionate and innately interested in the promise of Christianity, speculative philosophers are detached in their approach to their subject matter. To be a good objective thinker or scientist, one must be disinterested. By understanding Christianity as a historical phenomenon, speculative philosophy, asserts Climacus, misses the point of its true inward and subjective nature. History or speculative philosophy can discover many outward facts about Christianity and its development but nothing about its subjective significance. The issue is set up as follows: either speculative philosophers are believers and base their faith on their speculative philosophy, in which case they are comical since they base their eternal happiness on merely approximative knowledge, 98, or they are not believers and never allow the question to arise since they are so absent-minded and forgetful of themselves in their pursuit of speculative philosophy. But upon closer examination, this reasoning contains a false dichotomy since there is clearly a third scenario, wherein speculative philosophers are believers but are careful not to base their faith on their speculative knowledge. If speculative philosophy distinguishes the two spheres, knowledge and faith, scholarship and religion, then there is no conflict. Thus, Climacus is not critical of speculative philosophy per se but only of an inappropriate understanding or application of it by people like Martinson. Climacus allows for this third possibility and says explicitly that speculative philosophers can in principle be true Christians provided they make a clear separation between their faith or subjective relation to Christianity and their speculative understanding of it. There is no conflict, provided one recognize the limits of speculative philosophy and not try to apply it to ground one's faith. If the speculative thinker is also a believer, he must long since have perceived that speculative thought can never have the same meaning for him as faith. Precisely as a believer he is indeed innately interested in his own eternal happiness and in faith is assured of it, and he does not build an eternal happiness on his speculative thought. 99. One would be comical if one attempted to base one's eternal happiness on speculative philosophy since such objective knowledge, qua-scientific knowledge, is only approximation and cannot provide the degree of certainty required to stake one's eternal happiness. But so long as the believer observes this and continues to do speculative philosophy, seeing it all the while in its proper place, then there is in principle no contradiction, and the speculative philosopher can be a true Christian. This interpretation is supported by a journal entry from 1849 to 50, in which Kierkegaard writes the following in reference to the conclusions of the postscript: is scientific scholarship thereby abolished or made impossible? No. But the judgment about Christian scholarship has become something else. Instead of the innated conceitedness about going further than faith, faith is established in its monoreal right, and scholarship, or the scholar's life, is to be regarded as an enjoyment, a pleasure, etc. that he may wish for, which can also be granted to him if he, please note, declares for the faith, receives and acknowledges his order to remain courteously within its boundary and recognize scholarship not as higher but as lower. 100. Kierkegaard indicates that the goal of the postscript is to sketch the limits of objective or scientific scholarship, but he is careful to point out that he has no objection to it so long as it remains in its proper sphere. Here it is clear from Kierkegaard's use of the slogan going further that what is at issue is not Hegel's thought or speculative philosophy itself but rather Martinson's claim to have gone beyond faith. The criticism is of those Hegelian theologians, like Martinson, who confuse the two spheres and who base their faith on speculative knowing. Climacus is above all concerned to carve out an impregnable sphere for faith and to assign academic knowledge to its proper place, but it will be noted that none of this is a criticism of Hegel's understanding of Christianity or even an attempt at such a criticism. 3. Speculative philosophy and the paradox of Christianity. In this section I will treat a part of the discussion of the chapter Subjective Truth, Inwardness, Truth is Subjectivity. 101. Here Johannes Climacus repeats many of the most important doctrines sketched in the philosophical fragments and interprets them in relation to Hegelian philosophy. In a sense this discussion can be seen as a continuation of the section The Speculative Point of View, which was just examined previously in section 2. The issues that Climacus broached there receive fuller treatment here. In fact, he alludes directly to his discussion of speculative philosophy and the other objective approaches to Christianity discussed in the RST part of the book. 102 His main thesis here as there is that speculative philosophy is RST an inappropriate approach for grasping the true nature of Christianity, and second, a false understanding of the nature of Christian faith. Specifically, he argues that speculative philosophy is wrong when it tries to resolve the paradox of Christianity. I wish to argue that despite what might seem to be allusions to Hegel's philosophy of religion, the discussion here is only indirectly concerned with Hegel. Indeed, the main criticism is not of Hegel at all, but rather of treating an academic account of Christianity as the basis for private belief. Not surprisingly, these passages are rife with indirect allusions to Martinson, 103, who, as in the speculative point of view, seems clearly to be the main target of criticism. Climacus' criticism concerns the paradox of Christianity. His doctrine of the paradox is a complex one, which was treated in some detail in the philosophical fragments. In the postscript he writes, the Socratic paradox consisted in this, that the eternal truth was related to an existing person. 104 Christianity, however, represents the absolute paradox, the thesis that God has existed in human form, was born, grew up, etc. is certainly the paradox sensu strictissimo, the absolute paradox. 105 The key point for Climacus is that Christianity rests on this paradox, and the true Christian must simply accept it without seeking an explanation. The paradox of Christianity does all attempts at scientific explanation or discursive analysis. It is simply a mystery that must be accepted as such. According to Climacus, the problem is that speculative philosophy is not content to remain in uncertainty or in Socratic ignorance, but rather presses on in an attempt to explain the phenomenon. In this context, Climacus uses his familiar expression for Martinson, who wants to go beyond Hegel, and applies it to going beyond Socratic ignorance. Speculative philosophy tries to explain the paradox of Christianity, i.e., that the infinite, eternal God became temporal. But by explaining the paradox, speculative philosophy destroys the possibility of faith that requires paradox, uncertainty, and the absurd as its object. If the paradox is explained objectively by speculative philosophy, then it ceases to be an object of faith and becomes the object of scientific knowledge. When the objective thinker tries to base his faith upon this explanation, he misunderstands the nature of Christianity. By explaining the paradox, he destroys the very nature of faith. For Climacus, Christianity is supposed to be precisely an absurdity to the understanding. 106 It is repellent to reason and objective thinking. He suggests that the nature of Christianity is a mystery. Suppose that Christianity was and wants to be a mystery, an utter mystery. Suppose that a revelation sensu strictissimo must be a mystery and be recognizable just by its being a mystery. 107 For Climacus, the danger of the modern age is that the offense and paradox of Christianity have been forgotten, and people have simply become Christians as a matter of course, but in this way the very nature of Christianity is destroyed. According to his view, speculative philosophy, assuming a world historical perspective, overcomes all contradictions and resolves all paradoxes. It reconciles the individual with the world and with Christianity. 108 Christianity is essentially a paradox, but this paradox is forgotten in a Hegelian philosophical explanation of it and in an insistence on reconciliation. Thus, there is no longer paradox or offense but rather resolution. The moment of paradox is at best a transitory stage to be aufgehoben. The discussions of Hegel and Climacus are at cross purposes since they are clearly discussing two quite different things. Hegel wants to give an analysis in the academic eld of the philosophy of religion, whereas Climacus is concerned with religious faith. When Hegel analyzes Christianity according to the concept, he is concerned with a philosophical understanding of the Christian religion and not with personal faith. When a conceptual analysis is applied to religion, it renders the result that Christianity follows a conceptual movement. 109 But this is not to say that every understanding of religion or of Christianity must be conceptual or philosophical. It could well be that although philosophy interprets the necessity of the concept of religion at the level of the speculative thinking, there is nevertheless a paradox and mystery at the level of individual subjectivity and private faith. The problem is once again the attempt to base one's faith on a philosophical or conceptual understanding of Christianity. There is nothing in Hegel's position that would prevent him from accepting Climacus' doctrine of the paradox, given that it is to be understood in the context of personal belief. Thus, the criticism here ultimately reduces to a point about one's relation to faith and not about Hegel's philosophy. This seems to imply a criticism of Martensen who, to Kierkegaard's mind, regards a speculative understanding of Christianity as the null word not only for scholarship but also for religious faith, thus confusing the two different spheres. It will be recalled that Martensen, who in the context of the debate about Hegelian mediation, argued for the conceptual understanding of Christianity as the null word. 110 Thus, it is Martensen who holds the position that Climacus wants to criticize. For speculative philosophy's conceptual understanding of Christianity, the chapter Subjective Truth, Inwardness, Truth is Subjectivity 111 also treats speculative philosophy's understanding of Christianity. It must be pointed out once again that Hegel is concerned with philosophy of religion as a branch of philosophy, and his account of Christianity does not purport to be anything more than this. Philosophy is, according to Hegel's understanding, an examination of the concept, therefore, philosophy of religion is the field of study that examines the concept in various forms of religion. 112 It will be noted that there is no statement about the nature of private faith or about the individual believer. In this section I will give a brief account of Hegel's conceptual interpretation of Christianity. I will then argue that what Climacus criticizes is not this scholarly interpretation but rather an attempt to base faith on such an interpretation. His criticism turns out to be of Heiberg's exaggerated claims about the ultimate truth of the conceptual understanding. A. Hegel's conceptual understanding of Christianity. Like other forms of human experience, such as natural science, politics, and art, religion, for Hegel, operates with the basic categories of the concept. In the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, Hegel explains that Christianity contains within itself the three moments of the concept, i.e., the fundamental categories of universality Allgemeinheit, particularity Besonderheit, and their unity in individuality Einzelheit. 113 The concept is the universal form found in all reality. The conception of the divine in Christianity thus follows this structure as well. Hegel writes, the absolute spirit exhibits itself, alpha, as eternal content, abiding self-centered, even in its manifestation, beta, as distinction of the eternal essence from its manifestation, which by this difference becomes the phenomenal world into which the content enters, gamma, a finite return, and reconciliation with the eternal being, of the world it gave away, the withdrawal of the eternal from the phenomenal into the unity of its fullness. 114. Hegel characterizes these different aspects of the concept in their Christian form by understanding, 1. Universality as the abstract God, i.e., God as Father, 2. Particularity as the abstract God become man in Christ, and 3. Individuality or the unity of the two in the Holy Spirit. Christianity represents the highest form of religious knowing since it contains the self-conscious realization of the three aspects of the concept. At the RST stage, the divine is conceived as simple universality. 115 Self-consciousness externalizes itself and posits itself in the realm of the beyond. Hegel refers to this as the othering or externalization and Äußerung of self-consciousness. This conception is then right and thought to be a real, independent, ontological entity, the element of pure thought, because it is an abstract element, is itself rather the other of its simple, unitary nature, and therefore passes over into the element proper to picture thinking, the element in which the moments of the pure concept obtain a substantial existence relatively to one another. 116 God is conceived as a purely abstract other, who exists in the abstract realm beyond the mundane sphere. Here the divine is characterized fundamentally by the category of universality. Under the moment of universality, the sphere of pure thought or the abstract medium of essence, it is therefore the absolute spirit, which is at rst the presupposed principle, not, however, staying aloof and inert, but, as underlying and essential power under the reactive category of causality, creator of heaven and earth. 117. According to this view, God is an abstract projection of the self-conscious subject. He is thus conceived as a thought or something that dwells in the sphere of pure thought and thus not as a sensible particular. God is simply a static, immobile entity in the beyond. Understood historically, this conception of the divine as abstract universality corresponds, according to Hegel, to Yahweh, the God of Judaism. According to Hegel's view, nothing can remain wholly abstract. If something is to be determinate, it must also have a concrete, particular side. Thus, God, conceived as Yahweh or as the abstract God of thought, must abandon his universality and abstraction and enter into the empirical world of particularity. This then represents the second stage at which Christ appears as a concrete particular in the empirical sphere. 118. In order for God to be determinate, he must have some aspect of difference or some opposing term. The divine is, in fact, the negative in its own self and, moreover, the negativity of thought or negativity as it is in itself in essence, i.e. simple essence is absolute difference from itself, or its pure othering of itself. 119. With the coming of Christ, God thus becomes the self-opposed or other of itself. 120. God, as universal and abstract, and Christ, as concrete and particular, mutually determine one another. Each term needs the other to be what it is. Hegel says, the actuality or self-consciousness sc. Christ, and the in itself as substance sc. God, the Father, are its two moments through whose reciprocal externalization, each becoming the other, spirit comes into existence as this their unity. 121. Hegel calls Christianity the revealed religion since the divinity, by becoming an empirical being, is revealed or is made known to man. With Christ, God ceases to be an alien entity or something essentially different from man which confronts him as an other. Christ has a dual meaning rst as a particular empirical presence but also as an absolute being. Christ is explicitly the particular and night, an immediate, existing natural creature, and implicitly the universal and innate, the universal God. Hegel summarizes his Christology thus: spirit is known as self-consciousness, and to the self-consciousness it is immediately revealed, for spirit is the self-consciousness itself. The divine nature is the same as the human, and it is this unity that is beheld. 122. In the third stage of revealed religion, the two moments of universality and particularity are united. 123. Now the opposition between God in the beyond and Christ in the empirical sphere is overcome, and the sphere of the universal self-consciousness is introduced. Spirit is thus posited in the third element in universal self-consciousness, itis its community. 124. The death and resurrection of Christ represent the overcoming of the natural sphere of particularity. Christ as a particular individual must die in order to establish the ethical substance or universal religious community. This universal spirit is indeed the very nature of Christ, who thus only in death becomes what he truly is, the movement of the community as self-consciousness that has distinguished itself from its picture thought is to make explicit what has been implicitly established. The dead divine man or human God is in himself the universal self-consciousness. 125. Now universality of the absolute God and the particularity of Christ are aufgehoben and reunited in a higher form in the religious community. In the death of Christ, feeling, the domain of human beings, is united with thought, the domain of the divine, and thus in the living spirit in the Christian community people and the fulfillment of this deepest need, the need to reconcile the countless oppositions of human life. For Hegel, This is picture thinking's way of representing a profound philosophical truth. Now the relation of philosophical knowing to religious knowing comes into focus. Hegel claims that religion and philosophy have the same content but different ways of interpreting it. 126 He writes in the Encyclopedia Logic, "It is true that philosophy does, initially, have its objects in common with religion." 127 In terms of the levels of knowing examined in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the content that the dialectical movement examines in the religion chapter is the same as in absolute knowing. 128 Thus, the goal of philosophy, to unite subject and object and to overcome countless other dualisms, is already complete in the religion chapter, since the revealed religion affects the reconciliation. There is then both a religious and a philosophical interpretation of the monistic unity of the world. The religious interpretation, which understands this truth in terms of picture thinking, personifies the monistic unity of the universe in the Christian Trinity. For the common believer, these abstract truths can only be grasped in a simplified form by means of concrete examples and stories drawn from normal human experience. For example, God's externalizing of himself into the world and the return to himself are not grasped as a necessary movement of the concept but instead as a story of the birth and life of Christ. The conceptual truth of God and Christ are understood via the metaphor of the Father and the Son. For Hegel, although this religious knowledge is true in the sense that it corresponds to the concept, it is not adequate. It still requires a further kind of knowing for its completion. He explains, this form is not yet spirit's self-consciousness that has advanced to its concept qua concept, the mediation is still incomplete. This combination of being and thought is, therefore, defective in that the content is the true content, but all its moments, when placed in the medium of picture thinking, have the character of being uncomprehended in terms of the concept, of appearing as completely independent sides which are externally connected with each other. 129. The stories religion tells portray events as accidental, but for Hegel the concept that they represent is necessary. Thus, a philosophical understanding of the concept is the understanding of the logical necessity of its unfolding. Philosophical knowledge can see the concept as concept in its necessity without the veil of picture thinking. What is lacking in the picture thinking of Christianity is the ability to capture the necessity of the concept. The goal, for Hegel, is for the individual to recognize himself in the concept in its various spheres. Only in this way does the individual or a people become aware of itself. According to Hegel, this is not wholly possible with religion since necessity is still lacking. So far as spirit in religion pictures itself to itself, it is indeed consciousness, and the reality enclosed within religion is the shape and the guise of its picture thinking. But, in this picture thinking, reality does not receive its perfect due, viz. to be not merely a guise but an independent free existence, and conversely, because it lacks perfection within itself it is a specific shape which does not attain to what it ought to show forth, viz. spirit that is conscious of itself. 130. Self-conscious spirit must understand itself as the concept, and this is what Hegel understands by absolute knowing. For Hegel, Christianity thus represents the next highest form of truth after philosophical knowing. It has the same content as philosophical knowing, but it understands it not in the way philosophy does, as pure concepts, but as picture thinking. The myths and stories of the scriptures are not simply contingent or accidental but represent necessary conceptual truths. These truths are couched in the form of a story so that they can be accessible to all, but, for Hegel, the philosopher can divest these truths from their stories and see them in their pure, conceptual form. B. Climacus' criticism of Christianity as a form of knowing. With this background information about Hegel's philosophy of religion, the criticism put forth by Johannes Climacus can now be evaluated. Climacus begins by noting that speculative philosophy does not deny the truth of Christianity but claims rather to present it. By no means does speculative thought say that Christianity is untruth, on the contrary, it specifically says that speculation comprehends the truth of Christianity. 131 The problem is with what speculative philosophy takes this truth to be. For Hegel, when understood within the eld of the philosophy of religion, Christianity is the highest form of religion and, indeed, contains the highest truth. But this conceptual truth, which is of interest to Hegel, is, for Climacus, clearly different from the subjective truth and the paradox that he understands as being the necessary characteristic of Christian faith. Then it is not Christianity that is and was and remains the truth, and the speculative thinker's understanding is not the understanding that Christianity is the truth. No, it is the speculative thinker's understanding of Christianity that is the truth of Christianity. The understanding is thus something other than the truth. 132 As has been seen, for Climacus, Christianity means paradox, passion, and offense. It is more than simply a categorical movement. When speculative thinkers take the speculative truth of Christianity to be the null truth, then they are mistaken, since the truth of Christianity is something inward. Speculative thought, Climacus writes, is objective, and objectively there is no truth for an existing individual but only an approximation, since by existing he is prevented from becoming entirely objective. Christianity, on the other hand, is subjective. The inwardness of faith in the believer is the truth's eternal decision. 133 The speculative philosopher's interpretation cannot in principle be the truth of Christianity for the individual believer. Thus, the truth upon which one bases one's faith cannot be that of a speculative interpretation of Christianity. The criticism that Climacus takes up here was raised earlier against Heiberg's presentation of Hegel's philosophy in On the Significance of Philosophy for the Present Age. 134 In the critical responses to this work by Münster 135 and Tried 136 the objection was raised that a conceptual understanding of Christianity leaves out essential features of religiosity. While this understanding may be any for the philosopher, it cannot satisfy the inward longing of the religious believer. In his anonymous review, Tried argues against the claim that Heiberg makes for the subordination of religious knowing to philosophy. He argues that Heiberg is incorrect in demanding that we seek that which gives the soul its peace and its rest in this given itself, or in the knowledge of its true essence, which philosophy provides. He is incorrect in not recognizing religion for more than a subordinate, more mediated form. 137 He rejects the attempt to interpret religion merely as one form of knowing among others. This kind of a categorization reduces religion to a formalism, which can in no way satisfy the religious believer. Tried thus criticizes Heiberg's attempt to assign to religion a role inferior to philosophy. His contention is that the multitude of religious experiences and feelings cannot be incorporated in philosophical knowing, since they cannot be reduced to a conceptual form. Heiberg responded to Tried's review and to the question of whether there can be anything higher than philosophical thought. 138 His main argument is that so long as theology claims to be concerned with knowledge, it is continuous with philosophy, but philosophy is theology, otherwise it would not be what it is itself. And theology is philosophy, otherwise it is nothing. 139 Given this, theology can be compared with philosophy with regard to the question of knowing. Heiberg argues that philosophical knowledge does not destroy religious feeling but instead preserves it and understands it correctly in the idea. He asks his anonymous reviewer, what is it then that the reviewer, and with him virtually everyone else, is lacking in the speculative idea? 140 He explains that Hegel's philosophy is an examination of what Hegel calls the idea, i.e., the abstract concept and the concrete empirical instantiations. He argues that religious emotions such as love and hope are included in the idea insofar as they are innate forms of it. Thus, one need look no further than the abstract speculative idea to nd what one seeks in religion. Everything which one demands outside philosophy is thus contained within philosophy itself. Everything which is needed for our satisfaction dwells inside this circle. My reviewer, who, dissatisfied with possessing the innate determinations within philosophy, demands to possess them outside philosophy, demands the impossible if he does not want to give up philosophy entirely. If, by contrast, he wants to continue with philosophy, then he needs only to take a step forward, and he will then learn, if indeed he has not already learned it, that the occupation with the speculative idea produces all the joy, excitement, love, enthusiasm, in short, all the noble and elevated feelings, which he now seeks outside the world in which their existence is grounded. For all these feelings are the idea itself but not yet developed, in the development therefore they do not stop, but they are poured and made clear and thereby win in energy. 141. Thus, Heiberg claims that one need not appeal to an independent sphere of religion where religious emotions exist, but rather they already exist in philosophy itself, i.e., in Hegel's philosophy. In his rejoinder to Heiberg's response, 142 Tried gives a long list of religious terms such as redemption, reconciliation, and eternal life, which he says are absent in any abstract philosophical account. 143 The criticism offered by Climacus was also anticipated, oddly enough, by Martensen in his review of Heiberg's introductory lecture to the logic course at the Royal Military College. Martensen begins by arguing that some things cannot be incorporated into a rationalistic system such as Hegel's, but another question is whether rationalism is the philosophy or only a moment of it with relative validity, whether the age which strove for a pure rational knowledge, will be satisfied with its results now that it possesses the means to reach it. For the more these results become apparent, the more obvious it will become that it is insufficient to capture the entire fullness of life. Martensen names poetry and religion as ways of thinking that cannot be adequately grasped by a philosophical system based on reason. He argues that both contain something irreducible and inexplicable that is the system. If only the soul of logic exists, then poetry remains only the reaction of the concept and religion its symbol. And yet we cannot give up the demand that the soul of poetry should be more than merely rational and that the consolation which religion gives us should contain more than what logical consistency necessarily produces. There is in both something inexplicable, something which can only be understood by faith, a freedom, which to be sure contains necessity in itself, but is innately more than this. 145. Here one nds the clear outlines of Climacus' view. First, religion is conceived as something inexplicable to reason. There is a distinction between what reason and what faith can grasp. Martensen criticizes Hegel's understanding of Christianity as merely a form of the concept. If religion is only a symbolic form for eternal concepts or reason, then it is not the truth itself but only the truth's reaction. Likewise, it cannot be the absolute power in our consciousness, but only the object for a speculative or aesthetic interest. 146 Thus, like Climacus, Martensen argues that Hegel's philosophical system and Christianity ultimately cannot be reconciled. It will be noted that these objections are raised against Heiberg's presentation of Hegel's views and against Heiberg's synnated claims that everything is captured by the idea including the emotions and sentiments of the individual religious believer. While Hegel uses the term the absolute or the absolute idea to mean the whole of the universe, this is always understood in its philosophical sense as the organic unity of all the concepts that constitute the universe. There is thus no claim made about private emotions of particular individuals. Indeed, Hegel himself claimed that such things cannot be grasped philosophically, they belong to the bad entity of particularity and have nothing to do with philosophy. Thus, it is a distortion of Hegel's philosophy when Heiberg claims that one can and in it everything that one needs to satisfy the longings of the religious believer. Moreover, Hegel's conceptual account of Christianity in his philosophy of religion has nothing to do with the faith of the individual believer. His hierarchy of forms of knowledge, which places religion under philosophy, is to be understood only in the context of his system, and in this context religion means philosophy of religion and not personal faith. Heiberg's discussion connotes the academic discipline of theology with the more general term religion. On the one hand, in arguing that religion is a form of knowing and thus continuous with philosophy, he clearly has in mind theology, and indeed he even says so with the slogan "Theology is philosophy." But then, on the other hand, when he tries to meet Tride's criticism about a philosophical account leaving out essential aspects of the inward life and emotions of the particular believer, then it is clear that neither he nor Tride is speaking of theology anymore but rather of religious feeling and conscience generally. Thus, when Heiberg claims that the idea can satisfy this realm of private belief, just as it does the academic realm of theology, then he has clearly made a claim that goes beyond Hegel's philosophy, which purports to be nothing more than an academic, or to use his word, scientific, account of religion. Hegel clearly recognizes the conception of religious faith that Climacus makes a case for. Evidence for this can be found in the Spirit chapter of the Phenomenology, where he is critical of the Enlightenment's critique of Christianity. He argues there that the Enlightenment misunderstands the nature of religious belief by seeing it in terms of its own categories of empirical science or, as Climacus would say, as something objective. Hegel writes that the Enlightenment falsely charges religious belief with basing its certainty on some particular historical evidences which, considered as historical evidences, would certainly not guarantee the degree of certainty about their content which is given by newspaper accounts of any happening, further, that its certainty rests on the accidental preservation of these evidences, on the one hand, the preservation by means of paper, and on the other hand, by the skill and honesty of their transference from one piece of paper to another, and lastly, on the correct interpretation of the meaning of dead words and letters. 147. According to the Enlightenment, belief must be demonstrated by means of empirical evidence, and this is the standard it imposes on religious faith. The critical thinking of the Enlightenment easily demonstrates the many problems with the historical record and draws the same conclusion that Climacus does, i.e., this evidence cannot possibly justify religious belief. But the Enlightenment is mistaken when it thinks that the Christian founds his or her belief on the basis of historical evidence about Christ's life or on the exactitude of the philological record. Hegel points out that this is a misunderstanding of the nature of religious belief that does its own categories, which are distinct from Enlightenment reason. Like not appeal to this kind of evidence. The realm of religion operates with Climacus. Hegel indicates that one should not confuse the two spheres. Faith, in its certainty, is an unsophisticated relationship to its absolute object, a pure knowing of it which does not mix up letters, paper, and copyists in its consciousness of absolute being, and does not bring itself into relation with it by means of things of that kind. 148. Moreover, like Climacus, Hegel recognizes that faith lies in the inwardness of the individual. This consciousness is the self-mediating ground of its knowledge, it is spirit itself which bears witness to itself, both in the inwardness of the individual consciousness and through the universal presence in everyone of faith in it. 149. In the Philosophy of Right, in the context of Hegel's discussion of the inalienability of religious freedom, one reads that a human being must decide such inward matters entirely within himself. 150. Thus, despite Hegel's conceptual analysis of Christianity in his philosophy of religion, it is clear that he recognizes and indeed anticipates some of Climacus' criticisms of objective thinking in the postscript and is well aware that religious belief is not based on external evidence. Hegel, like Climacus, clearly distinguishes between the two realms, i.e., that of science and scholarship, on the one hand, and that of private religious faith, on the other. It will be noted that this same discussion is played out again in a debate between the theologian Ludwig Hellwig, 1818-83, and his reviewer, the aforementioned Johann Friedrich Hegel. In his long article, On Faith and Knowledge 151 from 1843, which was based on lectures given in 1842, Hellwig discusses critically Hegel's philosophy of religion and above all the status of religion in Hegel's system. This article was attacked anonymously by Hegel, 152, one of Martinson's students, who sought to defend Hegel's cause in the matter. He argues that Hegel's philosophy neither eliminates religion nor reduces it to something subordinate. Hellwig wrote a somewhat bitter rejoinder to the review, 153, insisting that Hegel's philosophy regards religion or specifically faith as a sublated form. All of this shows that in Denmark as in Germany this was a central point of contention in the discussions about Hegel's philosophy. Moreover, it is indication that Kierkegaard was not alone with his concerns about the status of belief in Hegel's philosophy. The conclusion to be drawn from this discussion is the same as that of the previous section. Hegel is concerned in his philosophy of religion with understanding forms and conceptions of the divine at the conceptual level. By contrast, Climacus is concerned with the personal faith of the individual. These two discussions, while very different, do not mutually exclude one another. There is nothing that precludes speculative thinkers from grasping the nature of the Trinity in a speculative manner, i.e., according to the concept, and then putting this understanding aside when they turn to the inwardness of their own conscience and to their personal faith. As was seen in the previous section, Climacus explicitly allows for this possibility. From the standpoint of speculative philosophy, religion stands under philosophy and is subordinated to philosophical knowing, but this has nothing to do with personal faith, which is absolute. Thus, given that Hegel's position is not excluded by Climacus, it is difficult to see how Climacus' comments here can be understood as a criticism of Hegel's philosophy itself. Climacus makes no attempt to criticize Hegel's interpretation of the Trinity or the development of the concept in Christianity. It seems once again that the objection is against a confusion of the two spheres, a confusion that both Hegel and Climacus insist must be avoided. Here one can see a clear-cut example of precisely what Kierkegaard himself indicated in the journal entry quoted previously 154, i.e., that his criticism is not of Hegel, whose scholarship he respects as scholarship, but of certain exaggerated claims made on behalf of Hegel's philosophy in the Danish context. While Hegel claimed that individual emotions and feeling were not the object of philosophical examination, Heiberg claimed that they were in the idea and that everything that one needed for one's private religious life was to be found there. V. Speculative philosophy and forgetting oneself. A criticism raised originally in the speculative point of view 155 but that recurs frequently later 156 is the claim that speculative philosophy leads the individual to forget himself. Johannes Climacus is suspicious of speculative philosophy as a potentially seductive or corrupting ignorance since it obliges one to abstract from the realm of existence and to concentrate on the aperspectival view of the universe as a whole. In this section, I will argue that this argument cannot be seen as a criticism of Hegel and is best conceived as a criticism of some of Hegel's over-enthusiastic followers. It recalls the objections, raised by Judge Wilhelm, that mediation leads young people away from their ethical duties. 157. The danger, which Climacus points out, is that speculative philosophy can distract and seduce one into thinking in an exclusively objective manner so that the fundamental question about one's own eternal happiness is never raised, but for the speculative thinker the question of his personal eternal happiness cannot come up at all, precisely because his task consists in going away from himself more and becoming objective and in that way disappearing from himself and becoming the gazing power of speculative thought. 158. Speculative thought tends to abstract from the individual since it aims at an analysis of the whole. Thus, the danger for one as a potential Christian believer is that one could forget oneself entirely in the abstraction of speculative thought and thus forget the issue of one's eternal happiness. Johannes Climacus takes up this criticism again later when he discusses speculative philosophy's attempt to incorporate existence into a system. His thesis states, a system of existence cannot be given. 159. Here he argues that the concept of existence itself is fundamentally at odds with the concept of a system of thought and thus cannot be captured by a system. System and conclusiveness correspond to each other, but existence is the very opposite. Existence is the spacing that holds apart, the systematic is the conclusiveness that combines. 160. The claim here recalls Kierkegaard's criticisms of Hegel's view of Socrates from the concept of irony. There he criticized Hegel for treating the life of Socrates as something niched. Such a view is only valid from a historical perspective that looks back on past ages and peoples. But there is never the sense of completeness for the individual living his or her life. Climacus thus points out that for those still living this sense of completedness is an illusion. When an existence is a thing of the past, it is indeed niched, it is indeed concluded, and to that extent it is turned over to the systematic view. Quite so, but for whom? Whoever is himself existing cannot gain this conclusiveness outside existence, a conclusiveness that corresponds to the eternity into which the past has entered. 161 Climacus contrasts the existing human being with the human being as presented by the system. The former is always in the process of becoming and is characterized by a continued striving. The latter is something complete and niched. The continued striving is the expression of the existing subject's ethical life view. 162 This is the point of the quotation from Lessing that Climacus nds so important. 163 Human life is the eternal struggle and search for the truth, not the attainment of it. This discussion leads to the criticism that speculative philosophy induces one to abstract from one's own existence and thus to forget oneself as an existing individual. Climacus seems to argue in principle against the panoptic view that speculative philosophy promotes, since it is a perspective that no individual human can really have. It is aperspectival and can only be achieved by means of abstraction, but who, then, is this systematic thinker? Well, it is he who himself is outside existence and yet in existence, who in his eternity is forever concluded and yet includes existence within himself. It is God. 164 Climacus sees pretension in the desire to view the world from a panoptic perspective of speculative philosophy, since this, he claims, is the desire to play God. He goes so far as to call this immoral. 165 Climacus takes up this issue yet again in the chapter Becoming Subjective from section 2. 166 There his criticism is that speculative philosophy tends to substitute the world historical perspective for the ethical. He begins by distinguishing once again between the subjective, inward realm of Christianity and the objective realm of speculative philosophy. As has been seen, the distinguishing feature of Christianity is the issue of eternal happiness. Christianity wants to give the single individual an eternal happiness, a good that is not distributed in bulk but only to one, and to one at a time. 167 By contrast, speculative philosophy tends to abstract from the individual and to view things from a world historical perspective. This then can lead the unwary individual to forget his own subjectivity and existence and to substitute the activity of speculative thinking for it. Climacus writes, it is supposed to be certain that the objective trend toward becoming an observer is in modern linguistic usage the ethical answer of what I am to do ethically. To be an observer, that is the ethical. That a person ought to be an observer is the ethical answer, otherwise one is compelled to assume that there is no question whatever about the ethical and hence no answer either. 168. Instead of being concerned with the ethical life of the individual, speculative philosophy recommends that one contemplate the world from a speculative perspective. Thus, the very activity of speculative philosophy itself is purportedly conceived as a positive ethical program. This cannot be a criticism of Hegel or speculative philosophy per se, since speculative philosophy does not compel one to forget one's own existence, rather, it is one's own attitude towards oneself and towards speculative philosophy that leads to this. The question is whether or not one allows oneself to be so absorbed in speculative philosophy and world history that one forgets oneself and one's own existence. As was noted in section 2, Climacus grants that a speculative philosopher can be a true Christian provided that he does not try to ground his belief in speculative thought. As in either/or, where the distinction was made between the sphere of freedom and the sphere of thought, Climacus here separates the two spheres, which he designates as subjective and objective thought, and accords each its own validity. The problem is when the two spheres are confused or when the objective usurps the subjective and becomes the only sphere. Just like Judge Wilhelm in either/or, Climacus here goes so far as to laud speculative philosophy provided that it remain within its proper sphere and not purport to do anything else, but I should add a word here, in case anyone misunderstands a number of my remarks. Honor be to speculative thought, praised be everyone who is truly occupied with it. To deny the value of speculative thought, would, in my eyes, be to prostitute oneself, and would be especially foolish for one whose life in large part and at its humble best is devoted to its service, and especially foolish for one who admires the Greeks. 169. Here he cautions the reader against interpreting his remarks as a criticism of speculative philosophy per se. There is no genuinely philosophical criticism here at all, but only a personal one directed at particular individuals. Moreover, if the criticism amounts merely to the fact that the individual becomes so engaged in speculative philosophy that he or she forgets to live and becomes inauthentic, then it matters little whether one is distracted by one's concern with speculative philosophy or by something else. There are any number of different ways in which one can be distracted from the question of one's existence and one's eternal happiness. One might argue that it is the abstract perspective of speculative philosophy that, by concentrating the focus on the macro level, tends to lead one to a perspective sub specie aeternitatis and thus to forget oneself. But the claim that speculative philosophy lends itself to this kind of self-forgetfulness cannot be a criticism of speculative philosophy per se. All science operates at this abstract level and is not concerned with individual cases as such. Insofar as the task of science is conceived as the discovery of general laws or principles, it is clear that abstraction from the individual case is a necessary part of all science. One can never think of a general law by concentrating exclusively on individual cases, let alone on oneself as an individual. The realm of science is the realm of universals, i.e., universal patterns, or laws. There can in principle be no science of particulars. Thus, it is hardly surprising that science forgets the individual person, since it never purports to explain the individual, qua individual, in the RST place. Climacus writes, "What is concrete thinking? It is thinking where there are a thinker and a specific something, in the sense of particularity, that is being thought." 170. The sort of thinking of particulars surely exists, but it has nothing to do with science, and to expect science to be concerned with particulars simply evinces a misunderstanding of the nature of the scientific enterprise. Science wants to end a general law for a particular phenomenon, and thus while it analyzes particular phenomena in a particular time and space, its aim is not to give a particular law for each such particular phenomenon, since then there would be as many laws as phenomena and nothing would have been explained. Thus, science is not interested in the particular, qua particular. The argument, if it is conceived in this way, must thus be a criticism of all scientific inquiry and not merely Hegelianism and speculative philosophy. The absolute concept, which, for Hegel, encompasses all the other individual concepts, is simply a perspective intended to win insight in the realm of science. It has no claim on the individual scholar, qua existing individual. Many realms of science require one, qua investigator, to take a wider view of the phenomena. Example: a geologist must view the geological development of the planet on a large scale in order to understand a particular geological formation in the present. Likewise, an astronomer or cosmologist must view the history of the universe as a whole in order to comprehend and explain the formation of stars, galaxies, and so on. The wide view of things is the natural result of any realm of inquiry that operates with the uncontroversial premise that phenomena are interconnected in various ways and thus must be investigated not as isolated, monadic entities but as developing systems. Climacus has no criticism of this as a method for science but objects to it as a way of understanding the life of an individual. But since Hegel's philosophy does not purport to evaluate the individual per se, this cannot be a criticism of his thought. This argument is, in all probability, intended as a criticism of specific personalities, such as Martensen and his students, who Kierkegaard believes have forgotten the ethical. Due to the abstract approach that they have learned from objective scholarship, these young scholars have become forgetful of themselves. The reproach here recalls the passage from Either/or in which Judge Wilhelm is critical of the negative effects of Hegelian philosophy on the young students of Copenhagen. 171. Here it is clear that the object of criticism is not Hegel's philosophy itself but rather the distracted young people who, captivated by the lure of observing events from a world historical perspective, have forgotten their own inward subjectivity. It has been noted 172 that Kierkegaard was jealous of Martenson's popularity among the students, and it could well be that the objection is aimed against him as a corrupter of the youth, who has seduced and distracted the young students from the most essential questions of Christianity. The argument is thus probably grounded in biographical and not philosophical motivations. 6. The criticism of the presuppositionless beginning. I now turn to Johannes Climacus' account of the presuppositionless beginning of philosophy. This appears in the section on the fourth thesis attributed to Lessing. 173. The thesis of this section again concerns the difference between the subjective and the objective approach to Christianity. As in his previous discussions, Climacus insists that the two spheres be kept separate. In the present section I will concentrate on the analysis under the heading A System of Logic Can Be Given, 174, which considers the claim that Hegel's philosophy purports to make a presuppositionless beginning. 175. This recalls the discussion from De Omnibus where Kierkegaard analyzes in some detail the threefold beginning of philosophy. 176. Climacus also criticizes the notion of movement in logic. 177. But since this belongs more properly to the discussion of the law of excluded middle, it will be treated later. 178. I will argue that Climacus is concerned much more with the Danish discussion of the issue of the beginning of philosophy than with Hegel. His comments are best understood as responses to Heiberg's claims on behalf of Hegel. Climacus' criticism concerns the beginning of philosophy, which had been an important issue in modern philosophy since Descartes and which was much debated in Germany in Hegel's time. In the concept of irony, Kierkegaard mentions it in connection with Fichte. 179 and Salger. 180. Climacus' treatment refers specifically to a long debate about the issue in the Danish discussion of Hegelianism. Before looking at this debate, I will examine Hegel's own account of the beginning of philosophy. His most detailed and straightforward discussion of this issue comes in an introductory section of the Science of Logic entitled With What Must the Science Begin? Hegel reviews previous attempts to ground philosophy either on some immediate truth or piece of knowledge or on something reacted, which is the result of mediation. True to his dialectical penchant, he indicates that this is a false dichotomy since everything is both mediated and immediate. There is nothing in heaven or in nature or mind or anywhere else which does not equally contain both immediacy and mediation, so that these two determinations reveal themselves to be unseparated and inseparable and the opposition between them to be a nullity. 181. It is a logical impossibility to begin with absolute immediacy or absolute mediation since the two are mutually determining concepts. To be sure, for Hegel, philosophy begins with immediacy, but this is already an abstraction and a reaction with reference to mediation. Hegel explains this as follows: simple immediacy is itself an expression of reaction and contains a reference to its distinction from what is mediated. This simple immediacy, therefore, in its true expression is pure being. 182. The philosophical science of logic begins with pure being, which is the most indeterminate and abstract category. In this sense it is immediate. But this conception of immediacy is determined by mediation. The other categories are derived from pure being, and from that point on objectivity becomes more and more determinate. These categories are implicitly contained within the abstract immediacy of pure being. Likewise, the abstraction and immediacy of pure being are conditioned by the mediation and determination of the other categories. The essential requirement for the science of logic is not so much that the beginning be a pure immediacy, but rather that the whole of the science be within itself a circle in which the RST is also the last and the last is also the RST. 183. In the Encyclopedia Logic he writes in a similar vein, within the science the standpoint, which in this RST act appears as immediate, must make itself into the result, and, what is more, into its last result, in which it reaches its beginning again and returns into itself. In this way, philosophy shows itself as a circle that goes back into itself. It does not have a beginning in the same sense as the other sciences, so that the beginning only has a relation to the subject who makes the decision to philosophize, but not to the science as such. 184 Thus, philosophical knowledge for Hegel forms a circle in which the last member returns to the RST, and there is no such thing as an absolute beginning without any presuppositions in the sense of the Cartesian cogito is thought to be. 185 Instead, the true beginning lies in the will of the individual to decide to contemplate logic. This beginning is made with complete abstraction and the category of pure being. In Germany, Hegel's claims to begin his philosophical system with the concept of being were criticized by, among others, Schelling and the younger Fichte. In the aforementioned preface to the German translation of a work by Victor Cousin, Schelling criticized Hegel's interpretation of the category of pure being as the point of departure for the philosophical system. 186 Schelling distinguishes between the abstract concept of being and concrete individual beings. He claims that the former cannot be immediate since it is merely an abstraction from the latter. Thus the experience of concrete entities, and not the abstract concept of being, is immediate and primary. In his Mammoth Beiträge zur Charakteristik der und Philosophie, oder Kritisgeschichte des Leben von Descartes und Locke bis auf Hegel, the younger Fichte argues against Hegel's beginning by trying to point out implicit assumptions, which he claims it contains. 187 There was thus already a lively debate about the issue of the beginning of philosophy in Germany prior to and contemporaneous with the debate in Denmark, which was the immediate occasion for Climacus' comments. The debate about the beginning of philosophy in Denmark was initiated by Martensen in his aforementioned review article of Heiberg's introductory lecture to the logic course at the Royal Military College. 188 In his article Martensen borrows heavily from Hegel's Encyclopaedia Logic. 189 True to Hegel's account, he sketches the beginning of philosophy as thought's innate abstraction from all determination in the categories of being and nothing. He writes, the thought which is independent of experience and consciousness but which determines both must also be set forth in the form, which is in itself without presupposition. Thus, one must abstract from every determination in objective thought itself. The only point which now does not fail, while all others fall away, the only glimmer of light, so to speak, which remains while all the other lights have since been extinguished in the night of abstraction, is the pure abstract self, the pure being equals nothing. This is the most empty and most contentless of all determinations of thought, but also that from which it is impossible to abstract. It is the one category which is without presupposition, but itself is presupposed and is contained in all others, and only here does thought win a foothold and can knowledge of the independent truth in itself begin. 190. Martensen praises Hegel's dialectical method for having exposed the groundless presuppositions of previous systems and having reduced them to absurdity. He likewise praises Hegel for ending the true point of departure for philosophy where previous systems had failed. Heiberg echoes Martensen's praise of Hegel in his aforementioned review of the doctrine of the Trinity and Reconciliation by Waldemar Henrik Roth. 191 In a long, tangential passage, he discusses the concept of a beginning in Hegel's system as well as Martensen's review. He explains that the RST moment in each triad is immediate and is sublated by the second which is mediated. Therefore, one need only trace the series of categories all the way back to the RST category in the RST triad to ND the most immediate category of all. For Heiberg, this position is occupied by the dialectically related categories of being and nothing. He claims that the basic opposition of being and nothing is absolute immediacy, which is itself the system's absolute beginning. 192 With this he concludes. One must recognize that the system really delivers what it promises, a presuppositionless beginning. 193 In the RST article of his review of Heiberg's Perseus, Sibbern treats the question of the presuppositionless beginning under the heading concerning the Hegelian conception of philosophy with respect to its point of departure and its entire foundation. 194 He begins by critically examining the role of the phenomenology of spirit in the system. Although in the introduction to the science of logic Hegel speaks of the phenomenology as a kind of propedeutic to the system, 195. Nevertheless, the RST categories presented in the science of logic are also purportedly the beginning of the system. Thus, it is not entirely clear where exactly the beginning takes place or if it takes place twice. 196. More importantly, Sibbern recalls Heiberg's claims, in the review of Dr. Roth's doctrine of the Trinity and Reconciliation, that the dual category of being and nothing is the absolute beginning, and challenges him to demonstrate how a beginning can be made from them. It would interest me to see Professor Heiberg make a start from this beginning, so that the thought is RMLY maintained that what is original is both given and not given. Also it would interest me to see him proceed from his nothing equals being as from what is original, which is by contrast what Hegel does. 197. Sibbern is suspicious since Heiberg has changed Hegel's scheme by treating being and nothing as a single category and not as two distinct ones in the sequence. He asks Heiberg for a demonstration of how a system of logic can be derived from this dual category. Heiberg responded to Sibbern in the next number of Perseus with his The System of Logic. 198. In his introductory comments, Heiberg states that his goal with the treatise is to examine the initial section of Hegel's logic with the aim of defending it against its critics. Although he names Schelling directly as a hostile critic, it seems almost certain that his real goal is to respond to Sibbern's challenge. In a sense, Heiberg simply repeats what he already said in the review of Dr. Roth's doctrine of the Trinity and Reconciliation, but in a more systematic fashion. The treatise is organized according to numbered paragraphs, and this is the form in which Heiberg works through the initial categories of a system of Hegelian logic. Just as previously in his outline of the philosophy or speculative logic and his review of Roth, Heiberg deviates from Hegel's analysis by combining being and nothing into a single category, which he insists is the absolute beginning without presuppositions. Sibbern was not Heiberg's only critic on this issue. The Hegelian theologian Adolf Peter Adler critically reviewed The System of Logic. 199. While Sibbern criticized Heiberg's Hegelianism from a perspective outside the Hegelian school, Adler's criticism can be seen as internal, given that he was at the time still very much under the influence of Hegel's philosophy and in particular his logic. Despite this difference, Adler's criticism of Heiberg is in many ways much the same as Sibbern's. Adler complains above all about Heiberg's modification of the RST triad from Hegel's sequence, A. Being, B. Nothing, C. Becoming, to the sequence, A. Being and nothing, B. Becoming, and, C. Determinate being. It is this debate that Climacus takes up in the postscript. The title of this section, A System of Logic Can Be Given, seems to be a reference to Heiberg's The System of Logic and to other works of Danish imitators of Hegel. This seems to be confirmed by the opening lines of the section, which refer to Heiberg, the dialectic of the beginning must be clarid. The almost amusing thing about it, that the beginning is and then in turn is not, because it is the beginning, this true dialectical remark has long enough been like a game that has been played in Hegelian society. 200. This paradoxical claim that the beginning both is and is not is one that Heiberg makes several times. In his outline of the philosophy or speculative logic, he argues in one paragraph that philosophy must be presuppositionless and must thus begin with nothing. He then continues in the next paragraph by claiming that philosophy must yet begin with something if it is to make a start at all. Finally, these two contradictory claims come together in a third paragraph where he writes, philosophy must then begin with a subject matter which is both given and not given, both something and nothing. 201. Similarly, in his review of Roth, Heiberg writes, a demand is made on philosophy that what is original, with which it begins, should be both given and not given. This demand is fooled with being equals nothing. 202. Moreover, with the reference to Hegelian society in contrast to Hegel himself, Climacus points to his Danish contemporaries and not to Hegel's primary texts. Finally, Climacus writes, Hegelian logicians deem the immediate, with which logic begins, as follows, the most abstract remainder after an exhaustive abstraction. 203. This definition comes not from Hegel but from Heiberg's The System of Logic. Heiberg claims that this original thing must be the utmost, the last abstraction from everything, and for this very reason it must be the absolute rst in the development, i.e. the beginning. 204 These passages leave little doubt that Heiberg's account of the beginning of philosophy is primarily at issue. Climacus is particularly critical of the pretension of beginning with nothing or without presuppositions. He summarizes the view he wishes to criticize thus: the system begins with the immediate and therefore without presuppositions and therefore absolutely, that is, the beginning of the system is the absolute beginning. 205 This is precisely the claim that Heiberg defends against his critics. As has been noted, he constantly refers to the beginning as absolute and presuppositionless. Climacus argues that the immediate category of pure being cannot be an absolute beginning since existence always comes rst. In other words, the system's relation to the immediate is always something derivative and not original. It is the result of abstraction. How does the system begin with the immediate, that is, does it begin with it immediately? The answer to this must certainly be an unconditional no. If the system is assumed to be after existence, the system does indeed come afterward and consequently does not begin immediately with the immediate with which existence began. The beginning of the system that begins with the immediate is then itself achieved through reaction. 206. In order to reach the immediate, one must abstract from everything else. Given that the system can only begin with reaction or abstraction, the question arises: how do I bring to a halt the reaction set in motion in order to reach that beginning? 207 Climacus claims that reaction is innate and is thus unable to stop itself. Therefore, something else must intercede from outside and stop it. Hegel also believes that the kind of reaction that can be characterized by the bad entity can continue indefinitely. However, true speculative thinking will stop by itself when it reaches the level of abstraction of pure being. This is the natural limit of abstraction, beyond which thought cannot go. 208 The human mind can conceive of nothing more abstract than pure being. Climacus claims that reaction can only be stopped by a conscious decision of the individual, and only thus can a beginning be made. 209 But this decision undermines the claim of an absolute beginning. But if a resolution is required, presuppositionlessness is abandoned. The beginning can occur only by something else, and this something else is something altogether different from the logical, since it is a resolution. 210 Decision and resolution belong to the sphere of freedom and not the sphere of logic and objectivity. This realm of freedom precedes that of logic or abstraction. Climacus writes, if the individual does not stop reaction, he will be innatist in reaction, that is, no decision is made. By thus going astray in reaction, the individual really becomes objective. More and more he loses the decision of subjectivity and the return into himself. Yet it is assumed that reaction can stop itself objectively, whereas it is just the other way around. Reaction cannot be stopped objectively, and when it is stopped subjectively, it does not stop of its own accord, but it is the subject who stops it. 211. Given that a resolution is required to stop reaction and to begin the system, the beginning ultimately rests on subjectivity. Moreover, according to Climacus, the act of absolute abstraction based on a resolution cannot be maintained, and before long it begins to lapse, and determinate content enters the scene once again. 212 Climacus seems to claim that this absolute exertion is impossible, and the result is that one does not begin with absolute abstraction but rather with some approximation thereof. But once again, this is not to begin with nothing. It should be noted that Hegel's position is essentially in agreement with that of Climacus. Hegel himself says that philosophy begins when the subject makes its own thought an object of investigation. This is for Hegel a free act 213 of the individual. In his discussion of skepticism, he makes it clear that the beginning of logic is an act of the will. It is not necessary that one begin with a method of universal doubt like Descartes in order to arrive at a position without presuppositions. The same result is effected, Hegel says, by the freedom that abstracts from everything, and grasps its own pure abstraction, the simplicity of thinking, in the resolve of the will to think purely. 214 Here it is clear that for Hegel as well the act of abstraction is performed by the will of the individual. Hegel's conception of philosophy as a circle is very much in the spirit of Climacus' purported criticism, since it implies that thought is a process and that there is no single XED point where everything begins. As has been seen, Hegel says directly that there is neither absolute immediacy nor absolute mediation. Instead, the two terms mutually condition each other. Thus, Climacus' criticism that the immediacy of pure being is not immediate but rather an abstraction, is perfectly in line with Hegel's point. Given that Climacus' critical comments are generally in agreement with Hegel's own view of the matter, it seems clear that Climacus takes as his point of reference the debate among the Danish Hegelians and not Hegel's primary texts. If he were interested in Hegel's understanding of the issue, the natural place to start would be with what must the science begin. But there is no account of or even reference to this text here. By contrast, given the many references to Heiberg, it seems far more plausible that the criticism is aimed at him and his claims about the beginning of philosophy. The point of Climacus' analysis in general is to show that while it is possible to create a system of logic in the way Heiberg has, this system nevertheless has nothing to do with existence or with what is really important. By contrast, existence itself cannot be systematized. Thus, the point seems to be that Climacus wants to contrast the system and its beginning with his own notion of existence and wants to argue that the two be kept separate. 7. The criticism of the world historical perspective. The next discussion to be examined is the beginning of the chapter Becoming Subjective from section 2. 215 Johannes Climacus discusses what has been thought to be Hegel's conception of world history and levels criticisms against it. There is one point of critique purportedly of Hegel which I will concentrate on here. Climacus claimed that speculative philosophy encourages the individual to dedicate his or her life to gaining world historical significance and thus to ignore genuine ethical virtue. I will argue that although some very general aspects of Hegel's conception of the philosophy of history are present in this discussion, the position Climacus wants to criticize is not Hegel's, since there is in Hegel's philosophy no ethical recommendation for action of this kind. There is, however, abundant evidence that the true target of this criticism is the Danish theologian Grundtvig. The criticism that Climacus levels is that speculative philosophy's grand view of things from a world historical perspective tends to encourage the unrictive individual to want to become a world historical personality. Since from the world historical perspective most individuals as such are of little import, one is encouraged to overcome one's limited individuality and to try to become someone who has a profound impact on one's age, just as Alexander the Great or Napoleon had on theirs. It then becomes a sort of ethical imperative to gain world historical importance. But, so the objection goes, the world historical view operates with categories that are different from genuinely ethical ones. Instead of encouraging individuals to be good or virtuous, this perspective encourages them to be influential and historically important. The absolute ethical distinction between good and evil is world historically aesthetically neutralized in the aesthetic metaphysical category of the great, the momentous, to which the bad and the good have equal access. 216 The moral monsters of history are proof enough that to be a world historical personality is no guarantee for having a morally virtuous character. The macro-level perspective of speculative philosophy, according to Climacus, leads the unwary individual to aspire to win world historical significance. 217 For Climacus, this is an inappropriate understanding of the subjectivity and the individual, who, qua ethical subject, should be indifferent to world historical fame, by continually being occupied as an observer of the accidental, that accessorium by which world historical figures become world historical. A person is easily misled into confusing this accessorium with the ethical and easily misled, unhealthily, erringly, and cowardly to being concerned about the accidental, instead, himself existing, of being innately concerned about the ethical. 218. The unwary individual concentrates on trying to gain world historical importance, which is largely accidental, and by so doing forgets the realm of his or her own inward ethical subjectivity. The individual thus cultivates all the wrong virtues in an attempt to become a world historical personality. With respect to this point, Climacus betrays a rather Kantian understanding of ethics, according to which the good lies in the goodwill of the ethical agent alone and not in the result of the action. Thus, the truly ethical individual is one who acts with deep ethical passion and is indifferent to the outcome or world historical significance of his or her act. True ethical enthusiasm consists in willing to the utmost of one's capability, but also, in never thinking whether or not one thereby achieves something. As soon as the will begins to cast a covetous eye on the outcome, the individual begins to become immoral, the energy of the will becomes torpid, or it develops abnormally into an unhealthy, unethical, mercenary hankering that even if it achieves something great, does not achieve it ethically. The individual demands something other than the ethical itself. 219. For Climacus, one should will and do the ethical for its own sake and not with the motivation of becoming a world historical individual. By acting for the sake of world historical significance, the individual sells his relationship to God, though not for money. 220. In other words, one betrays one's own ethical individuality and thus one's relation to God for the sake of world historical significance. The world historical perspective is, for Hegel, assumed solely in order to examine the concept in history. History judges concepts in the sense that it exposes their inner contradictions, but what it judges is logical consistency and not moral value. Hegel does not encourage anyone to become a world historical individual. Indeed, in a sense it is not in the hands of the individual anyway. Hegel says that world spirit uses world historical personalities to achieve its ends, but these specific individuals themselves have only a vague inkling of the higher purpose that they are serving. 221. Moreover, it would be strange for Climacus to criticize Hegel for these mistaken ethical assessments in view of the fact that he also purportedly criticizes him for having no ethics at all. 222. Clearly, if Hegel has no ethics, then he also has no ethical recommendations to offer about how one ought to strive to become a world historical guru. One might still be tempted to interpret this discussion as a criticism of Hegel given the importance of his philosophy of history. Some of the passages cited recall Judge Wilhelm's complaint that under the influence of speculative philosophy the young people of the age have become lost in the contemplation of the past, while forgetting their ethical obligations in the present. 223. That discussion concerned Hegel only indirectly, since it was aimed at the Danish discussion of the Hegelian doctrine of mediation and at unnamed Danish students of his philosophy. In Climacus' discussion herein becoming subjective, there are no quotations of or references to Hegel's philosophy of history and generally no indications that it is Hegel's analysis of history that is at issue. Thus, one must look elsewhere for the target of the criticism. In the Anglophone secondary literature, the standard view has always been that whenever Climacus criticizes world history and the world historical perspective, he has in mind Hegel's philosophy of history. The absence of quotations or direct textual references to Hegel's works should make one suspicious of this view. What has been little appreciated in this context is Climacus' criticism of Grundtvig's theory of world history. As was indicated in the introduction to this chapter, Kierkegaard was a virulent critic of Grundtvig's view of Christianity, his conception of the role of the Church, 224, and his theory of history. In 1812 Grundtvig published his Chronicle of World History, in which he, years before Hegel, gave an account of the march of peoples and nations. From 1833 to 1843 appeared his Handbook for World History, which continued in a similar vein. Like Hegel, Grundtvig claimed that the divine will was realized in history. Also like Hegel, Grundtvig believed in the possibility of reconciliation through history. He saw the Danish people as having a historical mission with respect to the development of the Christian religion. Moreover, the term world spirit, which is usually immediately associated with Hegel, was crucial in Grundtvig's view of history. There are a number of reasons to believe that Grundtvig rather than Hegel is the target of Climacus' criticism. Perhaps most important is the fact that Grundtvig, unlike Hegel, was a priest, and his conception of history was essential to his conception of Christianity. This is significant since Climacus' criticism is not of a historical perspective per se but rather of its leading away from what, to his mind, is true Christianity. Given that Grundtvig was a priest, his doctrine was perceived by Climacus as particularly dangerous to Christianity. Throughout his writings Kierkegaard consistently objects to the introduction of what he regards as foreign, secular principles and concepts into Christianity. For this reason, he has no qualms with Hegel's philosophy when it is understood as a secular philosophy with no pretensions with regard to Christianity. But he objects violently when the priests Martensen and Adler attempt to take specific aspects of this philosophy and apply it to Christianity. Similarly, it is not so much any particular theory of history that Climacus objects to here, but rather Grundtvig's application of a theory of history to an understanding of Christianity. It should be noted that 10 years later in numbers 6 and 7 of the Moment, Kierkegaard in his own name criticizes Grundtvig directly for confusing the secular with the Christian and for ignoring the true nature of the Christianity of the New Testament. This is thus a consistent point of criticism that appears throughout the later part of Kierkegaard's authorship. In the journals and papers there are a number of passages that associate Grundtvig with the world historical. In an entry from 1851 Kierkegaard writes, "Almost from the beginning Grundtvig was limited to listening only to himself. And always this insistence on Christianity as doctrine, propositions, and then the world historical." 225 In an undated entry, he writes, "Just as a basso at times can carry the tune so deep that one cannot hear it at all but only by standing close to him and observing some convulsive movements of the mouth and throat is sure that something is happening, so also Grundtvig at times goes so deep into history that one sees nothing at all, but deep it is." 226 These satirical comments are continuous with the tone of the discussion in the postscript. With respect to the postscript in particular, there are a number of reasons to believe that Grundtvig is the real object of criticism in Climacus' critique of world history. A careful analysis reveals that the work is full of indirect allusions to Grundtvig. In the beginning of his analysis, Climacus alludes to the community of believers, which was a stock phrase employed by Grundtvig who, in contrast to Kierkegaard, emphasized the religious community. Behold, faith is indeed the highest passion of subjectivity. But just pay attention to what the clergy say about how rarely it is found in the community of believers. This phrase, the community of believers, is used in about the same sense as when people speak of what is called a subject of sorts. 227 Later in his criticism of the 19th century as being obsessed with world history, Climacus. 225 J.P., Volume 6, 6733, pap.x4a56. 226 J.P., Volume 5, 6565, pap.x2a307. 227 Cup 1 p. 132, SKS, Volume 7 p. 124. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cb09780511498367013 Downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the Criticism of the World Historical Perspective 501. Alludes again indirectly to Grundtvig, but with regard to the present generation and every single individual, to let the ethical become something whose discovery requires a prophet with a world historical eye on world history, that is a rare ingeniously comic invention. But that it takes a prophet, not a judge, no, but a seer, a world historical brawler, who aided by one deep and one blue eye, aided by familiarity with world history, perhaps also by coffee grounds and fortune-telling cards, believes he discovers the ethical, that is, what the times demand, Now this is confusion, producing in two ways, something for which a person who likes to laugh must always feel indebted to the wise men. 228. From this passage it is clear that Grundtvig is the actual target of the criticism, since Grundtvig and not Hegel played the role of the historical prophet and saw the Danish people as invested with a specific world historical mission. Most significant is the reference to the ethical, which is at issue in the purported criticism of Hegel. What Climacus objects to is the ethical significance of the individual being conceived as something on the level of world history. For Climacus, by contrast, the ethical was always something individual. This is continuous with Kierkegaard's other objections to Grundtvig's emphasis on the community of believers at the expense of the individual. Hegel's image of the owl of Minerva makes clear his view that philosophy has nothing to do with prophecy or looking into the future, since its task is merely to interpret the past and to trace the movement of the idea in it. 229. Moreover, Hegel makes no attempt to discover the ethical in world history. When one studies the drafts of the postscript, one passage after another emerges in which Grundtvig is directly mentioned in connection with the world historical. As was noted previously, Grundtvig is known for his matchless discovery, den matchlos optigeels, that the living word is the true essence of Christianity. 230. Kierkegaard alludes to this in a draft when he refers to a wonderful matchlos light of world history and the future of humanity. 231. In this passage he indirectly refers to Grundtvig by employing the adjective matchlos, and associates him with world history. That the criticism is aimed at Grundtvig is clear in the following draft of the postscript: every more quiet concern about the religious, every more inward understanding that in fear and trembling applies ethical categories to itself in self-concern, readily feels painfully disturbed by world historical ale Norse unconstraint that nonchalantly is busy only with great visions and matchless discoveries, readily feels painfully affected by the Grundtvigian inept unruliness. 232. Here the complaint is that Grundtvig is so concerned with the world historical that he has forgotten that ethics is a matter of the individual and that ethical categories apply only to individuals. Grundtvig's absent-minded concern with the world historical is also satirized in the following passage. Grundtvig, on the other hand, is as a thinker a confused genius who gets carried away from himself into the heights, the depths, the world historical. 233. Finally, Grundtvig is criticized for his affected image as a Danish prophet. Grundtvig appears on an elevation in the forest background. He is artistically draped in a great cloak, has a staff in his hand, and his face is concealed by a mask with one eye, deep and profound, so as to see into world history. 234. While there is much more to be said on this issue and on the Kierkegaard-Grundtvig relation generally, these passages and many others like them suffice to demonstrate that when Climacus talks of the world historical, he has Grundtvig in mind and not Hegel. With regard to Hegel, at most one could argue that when Climacus talks of the historical tendency of the age, he has in mind both Hegel and Grundtvig, since a theory of history was central for the thought of both men. But even this minimal claim loses plausibility as soon as one explores in detail exactly what is being criticized in the individual passages. When one takes the trouble to do so, it is difficult to end anything resembling a substantive criticism of Hegel's philosophy of history, whereas by contrast abuse is constantly heaped upon Grundtvig. 8. The criticism of the unity of thought and being. The next question to be explored is Johannes Climacus' purported criticism of Hegel's claim to have united thought and being. 235. This comes up as an issue RST at the beginning of the chapter Subjectivity Truth, Inwardness, Truth is Subjectivity 236, and then later in a short passage in the chapter Actual Subjectivity, Ethical Subject, the Subjective Thinker. 237. I will treat these two passages as a part of the same analysis. The thesis of the unity of thought and being is, of course, one that appears in different forms with different nuances throughout the history of philosophy. For example, it is well known as one of the main theses of Parmenides, Descartes, and Spinoza. It is the central dogma of Schelling's Identitätsphilosophy, which ends its best-known exposition in the system of transcendental idealism. It appears in Hegel's thought as well, for example, in the phenomenology of spirit, which has as its goal to close the gap between thought and being. In his preface, Hegel writes, "Everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject." 238 The task of the phenomenology is to work through various forms of dualisms and expose their inner contradictions in order to reach a point where there is no separation between subject and object, thought and being, and so on. It should also be noted that the question of the unity of being and thinking is linked to traditional discussions about the ontological argument and to Kierkegaard's own continuing discussion of the question of mediation and the law of excluded middle. It is commonly accepted that Climacus' criticism here is of Hegel's principle of thinking subject as substance. But given that this claim is one that echoes throughout the history of philosophy, there is no reason to regard it as the private property of Hegel. I wish to argue that a closer examination of the matter reveals that in fact Climacus primarily has in mind not Hegel but rather Martensen and in particular his presentation of Descartes. In the RST account to be explored, 239 Climacus entertains two different possibilities with respect to the relation of the unity of thought and being. Either being is conceived as empirical in this relation, or it is conceived as an abstract concept. Climacus' argumentative strategy is to demonstrate that absurd conclusions can be drawn from both premises, which then allows him to conclude that the original claim about the unity of thought and being is false. The RST part of the dichotomy is that being is conceived as empirical or in Climacus' sense existential. Here what is at issue is not the general notion of being but some particular being or entity. If being is understood as empirical being, then truth itself is transformed into a desideratum and everything is placed in the process of becoming, because the empirical object is not niched, and the existing knowing spirit is itself in the process of becoming. 240 It is clear that Climacus is concerned with the being of human subjects who are always developing or becoming. One recalls from the concept of irony the criticism of Hegel's understanding of Socrates as something niched and complete in contrast to Socrates' own experience of his life, according to which he was always in the transitory state of becoming. 241 In this sense, speculative philosophy is mistaken when it claims to have reached some absolute or null truth about being, since empirical being is always becoming and thus can never be given a null judgment. Since the individual is not complete or niched, the abstract thinker can never reach the truth. Thus, this empirical understanding of the term being cannot be what is meant by the abstract thinker, since it does any claim for niched truth. While empirical being is clearly what Climacus understands by the being of an existing individual, it is antithetical to an abstract account, and thus the slogan about the unity of being and thinking must employ the concept of being in a different sense. Climacus now turns to the other side of the dichotomy. He supposes that speculative philosophy claims that what it understands by being is not concrete empirical being, but rather the abstract concept of being per se. Climacus explains this as follows: the term being in those definitions must, then, be understood much more abstractly as the abstract rendition or the abstract prototype of what being in Con Series 2 is as empirical being. If it is understood in this way, nothing stands in the way of abstractly denying truth as something niched, because, viewed abstractly, the agreement between thinking and being is always niched. 242. In fact, this is the way in which being is represented both in the science of logic and in the phenomenology of spirit. For Hegel, pure being is an indeterminate concept and not a determinate particular thing. But for Climacus, absurd conclusions also follow from this conception of being as abstract. But if being is understood in this way, the formula is a tautology, that is, thinking and being signify one and the same, and the agreement spoken of is only an abstract identity with itself. 243 If being is conceived merely as a thought, then there is no difference between being and thinking to start with. Thus, the claim that being is united with thinking is tautologous. Given that absurdities follow from both interpretations, it seems that the original claim of the unity of thought and being is itself contradictory. Climacus takes up this discussion again later 244 and presents in a more favorable light the second half of the dichotomy, i.e., being understood as an abstract concept. He grants that the unity of thought and being may well be true at the abstract level, but, he argues, it has nothing to do. 241 see Chapter 3, Section 6, pages 164 to 165. CIP 235, SKS, Volume 1 p. 276. 242 Cup 1 p. 190, SKS, Volume 7 p. 174. 243 Cup 1 p. 190, SKS, Volume 7 p. 174. See Rasmus Nielsen, Den Propædeutisk Logik. Copenhagen 1845 p. 26. ASKB 699. Nielsen explores the question of the tautological relation between being and thinking. 244 1 Cuban peso, pages 329 to 335, SKS, Volume 7, pages 300 to 306. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cbo9780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the Criticism of the Unity of Thought and Being 505. With existence. 245. In this way he shifts the focus of the argument from the thesis of the unity of being and thought to the speculative philosopher's relation to this thesis. Well, Hegel is in the right, and yet we have not gone one step further. The good, the beautiful, the ideas are in themselves so abstract that they are indifferent to existence and indifferent to anything other than thought existence. The reason that the identity of being and thinking holds true here is that being cannot be understood as anything but thinking. 246 Climacus once again complains that this unity can only exist as a thought. It leaves out of consideration existence as he understands it. Pure thinking is always general or universal, while existence is always the particular. 247 While thought can unite being and thinking, existence keeps the two separate. 248 The unity of thought and being may well be true, but it is an irrelevant truth to the existing individual. As in the discussion of the law of excluded middle, Climacus again underscores that the problem is not with abstract thinking per se but with the confusion of categories, which mistakenly sees an account of existence in abstract thinking. To conclude from this that the abstract does not have reality is a misunderstanding, but it is also a misunderstanding to confuse the discussion by asking about existence in relation to it or about actuality in the sense of existence. 249 The abstract conception of being is ultimately unsatisfying for the existing individual. The urgent question is about one's own existence and not about something objective or abstract. The problem is once again when one confuses the two spheres and takes the abstract philosophical concept for a satisfactory account of one's own particular being or existence. This discussion has generally been taken to be a straightforward criticism of Hegel. However, Hegel's role here is very much the same as that in the discussion about the two spheres of existence and thought, which began in either/or. 250 There the appeal was to keep the two spheres separate, and the criticism was not of Hegel per se since he consistently remained on the one side of the dichotomy, i.e., that of thought. The criticism was rather of those who confuse the spheres and seek the truth of existence in abstract thinking. This separation of the two spheres is one that Climacus returns to again in his discussion about the law of excluded middle. 251 At most Hegel is criticized for simply being irrelevant since his abstract thought has nothing to do with existence. However, as in either or, the harshest criticism here is clearly reserved for his followers, who confuse the two spheres. The most obvious hint that Climacus gives to indicate that Hegel is not the main object of criticism comes in the discussion of the ontological argument. Climacus describes the argument as follows: when, for example, it is said, God must have all perfections, or the highest being must have all perfections, to exist is also a perfection, ergo the highest being must exist, or God must exist, the whole movement is deceptive. 252. In a footnote to this, Climacus explicitly distinguishes Hegel from the position that he calls deceptive. He writes, Hegel, however, does not speak this way. By means of the identity of thinking and being he is elevated above a more childlike manner of philosophizing, something he himself points out, for example, in relation to Descartes. 253. Here Climacus explicitly distinguishes between Hegel and Descartes. To be sure, Hegel is associated with the unity of thought and being, but there is no conic sense that unity is consistently conceived as abstract. The problem seems to be with Descartes and others who confuse the abstract unity with some empirical element. This indicates that at least some of Climacus' criticism is aimed at Descartes. In the passage just cited, Climacus refers to Hegel's account of Descartes in the Lectures on the History of Philosophy. According to Descartes' dualism, there are two kinds of substance, thinking substance or mind and extended substance or matter. These two are united in human beings, but how they are united was one of the most difficult problems for Descartes to solve. At the beginning of this treatment, Hegel characterizes the central aspect of Descartes' thought as follows: the spirit of Descartes' philosophy is simply knowledge as the unity of thought and being. 254. Hegel explains the Cartesian cogito in terms of this principle: the I think directly involves my being. This, says Descartes, is the absolute basis of all philosophy. The determination is in my I, this connection is itself the RST matter. Thought as being and being as thought, that is my certainty, I. In the celebrated cogito ergo sum we thus have thought and being inseparably bound together. 255. Thus, it is not so much the principle of the unity of thought and being in Hegel's own philosophy that is at issue, but rather in the philosophy of Descartes, which Hegel presents. A closer examination reveals that Climacus has in mind in particular Martenson's account of Descartes and his cogito argument, which is interpreted as leading to the principle of the unity of thought and being. It has already been noted in the preceding discussions that Martenson's Cartesian slogans cogito ergo sum and de omnibus dubitandum est were ridiculed by Kierkegaard again and again. 256. Climacus' discussion of the principle of the unity of thought and being can be seen as an extension of the discussion of the RST of these. Just as with the other slogans, Martenson in the case of the unity of thought and being borrows from Hegel's account of Descartes in the Lectures on the History of Philosophy, where the formulation originally appears, and, by frequent repetition, turns it into a slogan. That Martenson is Kierkegaard's main source for the principle of the unity of thought and being is evidenced by a number of different texts. In Kierkegaard's notes to Martenson's lecture course Introduction to Speculative Dogmatics, 1837-38, one NDS reference made to Descartes' principle of the unity of thought and being. His notes from November 29, 1837, refer to the Cartesian cogito ergo sum as the absolute identity of thought and being. 257. Similarly, in Kierkegaard's notes to Martenson's Lectures on the History of Modern Philosophy from Kant to Hegel, 1838-39, the following is written: Doubt evil comes from two tive, just like Zweifel and dubitatio, and that between which it is doubted is, thought and being, or the content of doubt is whether my thought also has reality. In order not to remain in this doubt, Descartes wanted that one doubt everything, for only then can a point be found which it is impossible to doubt, and this point is, cogito ergo sum. This should not be translated therefore, 1, but I think, and, thinking, I am. Thought and being thus coincide. There is no contradiction in the proposition, ergo is thus a copulative and not a conclusive particle. 2. Similarly, I think should not be taken empirically, but it is the pure I, my self-consciousness, not my feeling or anything else. Concerning everything, Descartes thus says, I can doubt, for example, whether I am sitting here, but about my thought I cannot doubt. Thus here is the identity of thought and being. 258. In this passage 1 nds precisely the key formulation about the identity of thought and being. This appears here almost like a slogan on a par with cogito ergo sum and de omnibus dubitandum est. Martinson rehearses this same material in his dissertation, The Autonomy of Human Self-Consciousness. There he speaks once again explicitly of the identity of thought and being in reference to Descartes, as in this way in defiance of all external authority he sought the source of certainty. He found by means of his inquiry that the thinking spirit has existence in itself, that thought itself is the spirit's existence, cogito ergo sum. Consequently, since he had in principle shown the identity of thought and being, he taught that everything which is to have truth and certainty in itself is only to be sought in thinking itself. And further we may say that the truth's own concept lies in this identity of thought and being, then self-consciousness, which is the absolute for this identity, must be recognized as the source of all truth and certainty. 259. All of these passages are strikingly similar. In all three it is Descartes who is associated with the unity of being and thinking, and not Hegel. Thus, there is every reason to think that it is this presentation of the thought of Descartes that Kierkegaard has in mind when he has Climacus present the issue. The passage from Martinson's dissertation was discussed by Bornemann in his review of the work. In his account, Bornemann writes, if the Cartesian principle is this, I think and thinking I am, then what one says thereby is not merely that what is valid in the true human consciousness is present, i.e., the identity of thought and being, but also that human consciousness, doubting everything, starting from itself, can determine what is and what is not. 260 Thus, this was one aspect of Martinson's work which attracted attention and was thematized in the contemporary discussion, of which Kierkegaard was clearly aware. This is all the more reason to think that the unity of thought and being functioned as an encoded expression that referred to Martinson. Climacus continues his diatribe against Martinson, arguing once again that speculative philosophy forgets the individual. What is new here is his characterization of this forgetfulness as a kind of madness. The notion of a higher lunacy runs throughout the text. 261 The point is that even though objective thought may be true in and of itself, it nevertheless represents a kind of madness in its forgetfulness of the individual. The objective truth as such does not at all decide that the one stating it is sensible, on the contrary, it can even betray that the man is a lunatic, although what he says is entirely true and especially objectively true. 262 Climacus further caricatures Martinson, when an assistant professor, every time his coat-tail reminds him to say something, says de omnibus dubitandum est and briskly writes away on a system in which there is sufficient internal evidence in every other sentence that the man has never doubted anything, he is not considered lunatic. 263 Climacus references to the assistant professor and to the phrase de omnibus dubitandum est leave no doubt that he once again has Martinson in mind here. Although the context seems to be a purely philosophical one about the unity of thought and being, from the tone and content of the critical passages there can be little doubt that Climacus' criticism is more of Martinson and his uncritical relation to Hegel than of Hegel's thought itself. Climacus describes the character type embodied by Martinson as follows: if a German philosopher, RST transforms himself into a super-rational something, in order to answer the question about truth in an extremely satisfying way, this is of no more concern to me than his satisfying answer. But whether a German philosopher is or is not doing this can easily be ascertained by anyone who with enthusiasm concentrates his soul on willing to allow himself to be guided by a sage of that kind, and uncritically just uses his guidance compliantly by willing to form his existence according to it. When a person as a learner enthusiastically relates in this way to such a German professor, he accomplishes the most superb epigram upon him, because a speculator of that sort is anything but served by a learner's honest and enthusiastic zeal for expressing and accomplishing, For existentially appropriating his wisdom, since this wisdom is something that the Herr Professor himself has imagined and has written books about but has never attempted himself. 264. The problem is in Martenson's attempt to form his existence according to Hegel's philosophy. While Hegel's philosophy may be interesting and insightful on its own terms, it is wholly objective and thus has nothing to do with the individual or that individual's existence. Once again, the problem involves the category mistake of taking the objective for the subjective or allowing the objective to usurp the place of the subjective. 265. One is led yet again to the conclusion that the target at which the criticism is aimed is not Hegel, even though his position doubtless lurks in the background somewhere, as does his account of Descartes. Instead, when the key terms of the text are decoded, it is clear that Climacus has in mind primarily Martenson. Many of the arguments found here prove in the null analysis to be in large measure polemical and thus lacking in philosophical value. The philosophical point is merely the renewed plea to keep the spheres of existence and of thought separated. The criticism is of specific individuals who fail to do so and not of Hegel, since, for however irrelevant his thought might have been for the sphere of existence, he was at least consistent in avoiding confusing it with the sphere of thought, where his philosophy was valid. 9. Speculative philosophy and the law of excluded middle. In this section we return to the issue of Hegel's doctrine of the dialectical Aufhebung of the law of excluded middle, which comes up again and again throughout Kierkegaard's corpus. In the postscript the issue is treated in a couple of different places, each time in the context of a larger discussion of issues related to Hegelianism as Johannes Climacus perceives it. The RST account comes in the chapter Actual Subjectivity, Ethical Subjectivity, the Subjective Thinker, 266, and the second in the second division of the chapter The Issue in Fragments. 267. Climacus says that the former treats the issue in its logical or ontological aspect, while the latter discusses it in its ethical aspect. 268. These passages will now be examined in turn. 1. Johannes Climacus begins his account in Actual Subjectivity, Ethical Subjectivity, the Subjective Thinker, by alluding to the long debate in Denmark, discussed previously, surrounding the Hegelian doctrine of contradiction. 269. He mentions directly 270 the conflict on the issue between Bishopminster and the Danish Hegelians. 271. Moreover, he names Heiberg and Martenson explicitly in drafts. 272. When this issue was discussed in either/or, the main argument put forth by Judge Wilhelm was that there are two distinct spheres: on the one hand, the abstract sphere of thought, where there is no absolute contradiction, and, on the other hand, the empirical sphere of freedom, where the either/or is always present. This solution, which was borrowed from the Hegelians Heiberg and Martenson, allows Judge Wilhelm to grant speculative philosophy a certain validity while at the same time making it possible for him to carve out an existential realm of freedom and choice. In the postscript, Climacus affirms essentially the same solution that was proposed by Judge Wilhelm. On the one hand, one can speak of mediation and of the Aufhebung of the law of excluded middle in the realm of thought. Hegel is perfectly and absolutely right in maintaining that, looked at eternally, sub specie aeterni, there is no out/out in the language of abstraction, in pure thought and pure being. Where the devil would it be, since abstraction, after all, simply removes the contradiction? 273. On the other hand, in the realm of existence and freedom, the law of excluded middle is still valid. Climacus, like Judge Wilhelm, distinguishes between the two spheres and argues that the problem only arises when they are confused. The defenders of the out/out are in the wrong if they push their way into the territory of pure thinking and want to defend their cause there. The out/out of contradiction is eo ipso cancelled when it is lifted out of existence and taken into the eternity of abstraction. On the other hand, Hegel is just as much in the wrong when he, forgetting the abstraction, plunges from it down into existence in order by hook or by crook to cancel the double out. 274. According to Climacus, both the Hegelians and the anti-Hegelians are right, provided that they apply their principle only to their respective spheres. Thus, Climacus does not really go beyond the arguments of Judge Wilhelm. This is hardly surprising since nothing new had happened in the debate in the interim, and there is no evidence to indicate that Kierkegaard made a study of Hegel's primary texts after 1843. It might be noted that while both Climacus and Judge Wilhelm criticize the speculative thinker for neglecting the future while concentrating on the past, Climacus is more direct in indicating that what is behind this criticism is a specific conception of what the correct Christian disposition is. The principle of the either/or is fundamental for Christianity. He writes, but where everything is in a process of becoming, where only so much of the eternal is present that it can have a constraining effect in the passionate decision, where the eternal relates itself as the future to the person in a process of becoming, there the absolute disjunction belongs. In other words, when I join eternity and becoming, I do not gain rest but the future. Certainly this is why Christianity has proclaimed the eternal as the future, because it was proclaimed to existing persons, and this is why it also assumed an absolute out/out. 275. The Christian is oriented neither towards the routine of daily life nor towards the past of world history but rather towards the eternal. Yet as a finite human being, the believer cannot grasp the eternal as the eternal and thus must grasp it merely as the future. 276 Since mediation can only be applied to the past, the speculative thinker is essentially oriented towards the past, which according to Climacus is thus contrary to the true Christian orientation. This comparison of the Christian orientation with that of speculative philosophy at RST seems puzzling since the two would not seem to have anything to do with one another in any obvious way that would invite comparison in the RST place. When Hegel analyzes world history, there is no claim that such an analysis is a part of a true Christian disposition or orientation towards belief. But this comparison begins to make sense when one regards the criticism as directed not at Hegel but at Martinson. The essential difference here is that while Hegel limits his analysis to philosophical subject matter, the Hegelian Martinson applies specific Hegelian principles in the context of Christianity. This is what Climacus objects to. 277 There are indications in Climacus' discussion that confirm that the real target is Martinson, who is seen as mistakenly importing Hegel's philosophy into religion. Climacus refers to Martinson as the doubting youth, which recalls the expression de omnibus dubitandum est. 278 Let a doubting youth, but an existing doubter with youth's lovable boundless cadence in a hero of scientific scholarship, venture to nd in Hegelian positivity the truth for existence, he will write a dreadful epigram on Hegel. 279 This seems to be a description of the plot of Kierkegaard's aborted work, Johannes Climacus, or De Omnibus Dubitandum Est, which was inspired by Martinson. Climacus' criticism here is that there is a clear absurdity in looking for the truth of existence in speculative philosophy. Thus, the criticism is not of any given principle or doctrine in Hegel's philosophy but instead of Martinson and 275 Cup 1 p. 307, SKS, Volume 7 p. 279 f. 276 Cup 1 p. 306, SKS, Volume 7 p. 278 f. 277 see Chapter 8, Section I. Pages 347 to 355. 278 see Chapter 5, Section I. 279 Cup 1 p. 310, SKS, Volume 7 p. 282. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/101780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the Speculative Philosophy and Law of Excluded Middle 513. Those like him who have purportedly sought the truth of their own existence in Hegel's system? This displays a confusion of the two spheres, since one should not think to look in a system of logic for the truth about existence. While there are elaborations of specific points, with respect to the issue of Hegel's criticism of the law of excluded middle, Climacus' position is essentially that of Judge Wilhelm. Judge Wilhelm is concerned that speculative philosophy leads astray nameless young people, i.e., Martinson's students, by enticing them to forget themselves in the contemplation of world history. Similarly, Climacus seems keen to criticize Martinson's confusion of Christianity with Hegelianism. Despite the two different pseudonyms and the passage of time between either /or and the postscript, the criticism here seems essentially the same. 2. In the chapter The Issue in Fragments, Johannes Climacus makes reference to this previous discussion and continues it. 280 The analysis here, he indicates, represents the ethical aspect of the issue of the law of excluded middle. In this account, Climacus talks about the concept of mediation in relation to what he calls the absolute, tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. By this term, he seems to refer to the eternal happiness of salvation, which is the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma of human beings. As has been seen, for Climacus the free choice of Christian belief is an absolute one of innate importance to the individual, given the fact that what is at issue is one's eternal happiness. The problem with mediation in this regard is twofold. First, it does not recognize the absolute decision or the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma and instead tries to mediate. Thus, it does not see the question of whether to be a Christian or not as an absolute choice. On this view, one can be partially a Christian or can believe a little. It thus reduces an absolute choice to a relative one where this sort of mediation is possible. Climacus puts it thus: when it is a matter of relative elements, mediation can have its significance, that they are all equal before mediation, but when it is a matter of the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma, mediating means that the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma is reduced to a relative tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. 281 While many decisions might admit of compromises or partial mediation, the decision enjoined by Christianity and by the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma is absolute. One believes or one does not believe, there is no middle way. Second, the principle of mediation cannot be applied where one of the opposed terms is the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. Mediation is possible between opposite terms on the same level, but makes no sense between terms that are not equal. The absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma, qua absolute, is innately higher than any relative decision and therefore cannot be compared with such a decision. The absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma is in a category by itself. Thus, when mediation tries 280 Cup 1 p 399, SKS, Volume 7 p 363. 281 Cup 1 p 400, SKS, Volume 7 p 364. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/CB09780511498367013 Downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the 514 Hegel in the postscript. To see the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma as merely one term among others, it misses the very point of the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. Climacus takes a counselor of justice as an example of complacent Christianity. He writes, but let the counselor take care that he does not proceed to do both all this and have time to direct his life toward the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. In other words, This both slash and means that the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma is on the same level with everything else. But the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma has the remarkable quality of wanting to be the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma at every moment. 282 The term absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma is new here, but the point has been made before. The concept of the Aufhebung of contradictory pairs does not apply to the sphere of existence, which is the sphere of individual faith. In short, the existential cannot be mediated. The criticism is aimed at the notion of mediation as applied to Christian belief. While the principle of mediation clearly originates in Hegel's metaphysics, Hegel makes no attempt to apply it to the belief of the individual. Hegel never tries to mediate the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. Thus, the criticism must be of some Hegelian, presumably Martinson, who applies this principle to Christianity. One indication that this is indeed the case is that Martinson's plea for skeptical doubt is referred to in this passage. One writes on paper, doubt everything, then one has doubted everything. 283 Once again, this recalls Martinson's slogan, De omnibus dubitandum est. It also underscores the crucial difference between merely saying something and actually putting it into practice, something that Martinson, in the manuscript Johannes Climacus or De omnibus dubitandum est, was reproached for not having appreciated. Moreover, Climacus alludes to Martinson's reference to the famous saying attributed to Archimedes. In his review of Heiberg's introductory lecture to the logic course at the Royal Military College, Martinson describes Hegel's search for the true, stable point of departure for philosophy and compares it with ending the Archimedean point, finding this means nothing more or less than ending the point outside the world, which the ancient Greek sages already sought. De mihi punctum and saelum terram mubbo. This point, independent of experience and consciousness, Hegel sought to end by carrying out dialectical doubt. 284 Climacus refers to this as follows: mediation looks fairly good on paper. First one assumes the night, then the innate, and then one says on paper, this must be mediated. An existing person has unquestionably found there the secure foothold outside existence where he can mediate, on paper. The Archimedean point has been found, but one does not notice that. 282 Cup 1 p 401, SKS, Volume 7 p 365. 283 Cup 1 p 405, SKS, Volume 7 p 369. 284 Hans Lassen Martinson, Involgningsforedrag till det I November 1834 begint Logiska. Cursus, OPCIT, p. 521. Discussed in Chapter 5, Section 3, p. 266f. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/10.17/CB09780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the absence of an ethics in the system 515. It has succeeded in moving the whole world. 285 The criticism is that although Hegel's philosophy has found a stable point from which to begin, this is irrelevant for the realm of existence. Mediation can take place among the abstract categories of thought, but it has nothing to do with existential choice and religious faith. These two discussions merely conream and dash out what has already been said about the issue of mediation in either / or and elsewhere. In the RST account, very little new is discussed, but instead the issue of mediation is blended together with a number of other criticisms of Hegelianism. The second account discusses the impossibility of mediation in the ethical sphere, which is characterized by absolute choice and the absolute tau epsilon lambda O final sigma. Generally speaking, Climacus' position on the issue of mediation is more or less the same as that of Judge Wilhelm, with the exception of the introduction of the term the absolute tau epsilon lambda o final sigma. The Aufhebung of opposites and the either/or of choice are assigned to separate spheres where each has its own validity. The critical points of both discussions are aimed at an improper application of the Hegelian principle and not at that principle itself. The absence of an ethics in the system. One criticism to which Johannes Climacus does not devote any extended analysis but that comes up in many scattered passages is his claim that the system, presumably Hegel's philosophy, has no ethics. 286. This criticism was issued earlier in Fear and Trembling, 287 Stages on Life's Way, 288 and in the Journals and Papers. 289 in the postscript. The claim that the system has no ethics is so frequent that it comes to sound almost formulaic. Although Climacus does not develop this criticism in any detail, it is at least worth a brief glance if only because it is repeated so often. I will argue that what lies behind this criticism is a specific conception of ethics, which is at odds with that of Hegel. 285 Cup 1 p. 419, SKS, Volume 7 p. 381. 286 Cup 1 p. 119, SKS, Volume 7 p. 115. Cup 1 p. 121, SKS, Volume 7 p. 116. Cup 1 p. 133 f. SKS, Volume 7 p. 125 f. Cup 1 p. 296 fn, SKS, Volume 7 p. 270 fn. Cup 1 p. 307 fn, SKS, Volume 7, p. 279 fn 287 ftp 83, SKS, Volume 4 p. 173. Accordingly, this examination must constantly wander into the territory of ethics, while in order to be of consequence it must seize the problem with aesthetic fervor and concupiscence. These days, ethics rarely involves itself with a question like this. The reason must be that the system has no room for it. 288 SLP 231, SKS, Volume 6 p. 215, basically, it is easy enough except for someone who has been lent the helping hand of the privateer wealth of the system and thereby in turn the beggar's staff. Only if one is so circumspect as to want to construct a system without including ethics does it work, then one obtains a system in which one has everything else, and has omitted the one thing needful. 289 CPF, Supplement, p. 207, pap.vb 41 p. 96. JP, Volume 2, 1611, SKS, Volume 20 p. 44, NB, 42. Pap. 7-2b 253 p. 162 p. 214 f. JP, Volume 1, 654, Pap. 8-2b 86 p. 171 f. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cbo9780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the 516 Hegel in the postscript. It is worthwhile here at the beginning to say a word about Hegel's understanding of ethics in order to determine whether or not he had an ethical theory. 290 For Hegel, ethics, like other realms of human activity, embodies the movement of the concept. Thus, when he analyzes various ethical theories, he does so in terms of the concept. In both the Phenomenology of Spirit and the Lectures on the Philosophy of History, he offers extended accounts of conceptions of ethical life embodied in various concrete historical communities, for example, the Greeks and the Romans. Moreover, both the Phenomenology and the Philosophy of Right offer extended criticisms of Kant's ethical theory as well as various ethical views of the Romantics. In the Philosophy of Right he puts forth his own theory and sketches what he regards as the rational state. By this he understands not merely a specific form of government but the whole network of relations including individuals, families, work conditions, cultural values, and religion. For Hegel, in the course of history these relations develop gradually and come to constitute the ethical life of a people. His thesis is that this development is dictated by the idea of freedom, which slowly emerges in human history. The goal of the philosopher is then to recognize the rational elements in existing reality, which correspond to this idea. Thus, from this and from what was said previously about Hegel's conception of ethics, 291 there can be no doubt that Hegel had some theory of ethics, although it may be one that is idiosyncratic in certain ways. The criticism of Hegel for not having an ethical theory is not unique to Johannes Climacus. In fact, this charge was raised in the Danish context by Sibbern in his review of Persius. 292 While Sibbern sees in Hegel some interesting fragments of a moral philosophy, he criticizes him for not working them out in more detail. Moreover, Hegel was also reproached for not having an ethics by Martensen, who is usually portrayed by Kierkegaard as one of Hegel's naive and uncritical supporters. In 1841 in the preface to his Outline to a System of Moral Philosophy, Martensen writes, "It can be considered strange that Hegel has not given his contemporaries a worked-out ethics, as he has given them a worked-out aesthetics and philosophy of religion." 293 Moreover, Martensen is critical of the attempt to understand Hegel's theory of the state as a substitute for an ethical theory. He claims, however, that the foundations 290 See Alan W. Wood, Does Hegel Have an Ethics? In his Hegel's Ethical Thought, Cam. Bridge, Cambridge University Press 1990, pages 8-11. 291 Chapter 7, Section 2, pages 310-315. 292 Frederick Christian Sibbern, Persius, Journal for den Spekulative Idee. Ujjavan AFUN. Ludwig Heiberg. NR1, OPCIT, Article I pages 322-323. Frederick Christian Sibbern, Bemerninger og Undersøgelser, Fornemmelig betreffende Hegels Philosophie, OPCIT, pages 40-41. 293 Hans Lassen Martensen, Grundrids til Moral Philosophy and System, Copenhagen 1841, p. 6. ASKB 650. English translation, Outline to a System of Moral Philosophy in between Hegel and Kierkegaard, Hans L. Martensen's Philosophy of Religion, tr by Curtis L. Thompson and David J. Kangas, OPCIT, p. 247. Cambridge Books Online Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009 Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/CB09780511498367013 Downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the absence of an ethics in the system 517. For an ethical theory are already present in Hegel but still need to be developed. Everyone who has studied attentively the philosophy of religion and the aesthetics will have had ample opportunity to be persuaded that Hegel has known a higher morality than that whose end is absorbed in the state. These works contain the clearest indications of a higher ethical knowledge, and especially the aesthetics contain significant contributions to knowledge of the purely ideal meaning of the moral personality. 294. Martensen makes it his goal to work out what he sees as the implicit theory contained in Hegel's thought and thus to go further than Hegel. What is surprising here is that Martensen is not the uncritical Hegelian he is portrayed as being and, moreover, that Climacus in fact uses Martensen's criticism of Hegel. Perhaps what irritated Kierkegaard the most was not that Martensen's position contradicted his own but rather that they held views on some issues that were all too similar. 295. One of the basic points of Climacus' criticism seems to be that there is an absurdity in the idea of having a complete philosophical system that lacks in ethics. He alludes to the criticism in Stages on Life's Way when he writes, "Certainly everyone will also perceive that what another author has observed regarding the Hegelian system is entirely in order, that through Hegel a system, the absolute system, was brought to completion, without having an ethics." 296. This passage seems to ask the question of how it is possible to write a philosophical system and to forget ethics, which traditionally belongs to any systematic account of philosophy. For Climacus, the fact that Hegel's philosophy has no ethics is another piece of evidence that Hegelian philosophers are essentially absent-minded with respect to their own existence and the ethical responsibilities that it enjoins. He writes, whereas the Hegelian system in absent-mindedness goes ahead and becomes a system of existence, and what is more, is nicht, without having an ethics, the very home of existence, the other simpler philosophy, presented by an existing individual for existing individuals, is especially intent upon advancing the ethical. 297. This is consistent with Climacus' claim that the system leads people to neglect their religious life since it encourages them to contemplate the past instead of anticipating salvation in the future. Such abstract contemplation has led these Hegelian philosophers to forget ethics altogether, even. 294. Ibid, p. 7. English translation, pages 247 to 248. 295. With regard to the general overlap in views, Kroxall claims the following, in spite, however, of Kierkegaard's criticisms there are echoes of Martensen's science in Kierkegaard's pages, and points of contact. Th. Kroxall, Hegelianism in Denmark, in his translation Johannes Climacus, or De Omnibus Dubitandum Est and a Sermon, London, Adam and Charles Black 1958 p. 49. 296. Cup 1 p. 119, SKS, Volume 7 p. 115. 297. Cup 1 p. 121, SKS, Volume 7 p. 116. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cb09780511498367013. Downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the 518 Hegel in the postscript. Ethics as a part of the system. There are other similar passages, 298, but Climacus never really sustains this criticism or develops it further. In any case, these passages will suffice to represent his criticism on this point. A facile solution to the problem raised by this criticism would be simply to point out that Hegel in fact does have an ethical theory and to conclude that Kierkegaard's pseudonyms are mistaken in their claim to the contrary. But simply to point to the fact that Hegel does indeed have an ethics is neither interesting nor informative, since surely Kierkegaard knew this. I would like rather to argue that, while Hegel wrote and theorized about ethics, his conception of it is wholly different from that of Climacus, and that this is the actual reason for the criticism. What Climacus understands by ethics or the ethical is a large issue that cannot be addressed adequately here. However, suffice it to say that for him ethics is not an abstract field of inquiry as it was for Kant or Mill, rather, it concerns one's own existence and self-understanding, which he claims the followers of Hegel's philosophy forget. Climacus often lauds Socrates or Greek philosophers generally, since their philosophy was immediately connected with the way in which they led their lives. These thinkers are contrasted explicitly to the academic German philosopher of the university. 299. Throughout his corpus, Kierkegaard often refers to the biographical anecdotes in Diogenes Laertius' lives of eminent philosophers. 300. The philosophers portrayed there, regardless of how strange or idiosyncratic, are for him a model for the philosophical life. These thinkers are hailed as living and acting with passion, whereas the speculative philosopher is criticized as lacking passion. But, as has been noted, Hegel, along with the rest of the tradition of ethical thought in the 18th and 19th centuries, has a completely different conception of ethics. For him, self-evaluation or self-understanding may be valid in and of itself, but it cannot be the object of scholarly inquiry or what he calls science. Science in its different spheres attempts to examine the concept, which is universal, and it would be absurd to try to apply this to individual self-understanding, which by its very nature is particular. Thus, when Climacus says that Hegel has no ethics, he is not denying that Hegel had a theory of ethics in the philosophy of right, but instead he is indicating that Hegel did not give an account of the individual, qua individual, in that person's self-relation. This clearly falls outside the realm of science for Hegel. But yet, upon closer 298 e.g., Cup 1 p. 296 fn, SKS, Volume 7 p. 270 fn, Hegelian philosophy culminates in the thesis that the outer is the inner and the inner is the outer. With this, Hegel has niched. But this principle is essentially an aesthetic metaphysical principle, and in this way Hegelian philosophy is happily and safely niched without having anything to do with the ethical and the religious. See Cup 1 p. 307 fn, SKS, Volume 7 p. 279 fn 299 Cup 1 p. 191, SKS, Volume 7 p. 175. 300 Diogenes Laertius, Divitis Philosophorum Libri X, Leipzig 1833. ASKB 1109. Diogen Laertius. Lososk History, Volumes 1-2, tr by Borgerius Bry, Copenhagen 1812. ASKB 1110-1111. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cb09780511498367.013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the absence of an ethics in the system 519. Consideration, it also, albeit for different reasons, falls outside the realm of science for Climacus. The whole point of Climacus' analysis is that the ethical, as he understands it, is something fundamentally distinct from the sphere of science and scholarship. Indeed, many of the mistakes of modern scholarship stem from confusing the two spheres. Given this, it would be inconsistent to criticize Hegel for having no ethics in his system, since his analysis has shown that ethics does not belong in a system in the RST place. Indeed, on Climacus' own premises he has no reason to expect to end an ethics in a systematic philosophy. For Hegel to give a detailed account of ethics within the system would amount either to a mistaken conception of ethics, i.e., as an obtusely abstract one worthy of criticism, or to a confusion of the spheres, i.e., of the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity, of the subjective and the objective, of ethics and science, etc. Put differently, Climacus' criticism condemns Hegel both ways: either Hegel has an ethics within the system, and this is wrong since ethics cannot be systematized and belongs to the realm of freedom, or Hegel has no ethics within the system and has thus forgotten ethics entirely. Given this way of setting up the issue, it is in principle not possible for Hegel to avoid one of the two horns of the dilemma. This criticism differs from the previous ones insofar as it cannot with any certainty be traced back directly to one of Kierkegaard's Danish contemporaries, although later it is attributed to Adler 301. But yet it is still not clear that it is best conceived as a criticism of Hegel himself, since it may be part of the general criticism about the self-forgetfulness of specific Hegelians. It might be seen as a criticism of the corrupting influence of Hegel's philosophy on young people in that it leads them away from concentrating on the ethical aspect of their own life and tempts them to become absorbed in abstract contemplation. But once again, this has nothing to do with the Hegel of the primary texts. It will be noted that in this context there is no discussion of Hegel's actual account of ethics in the philosophy of right. This said, this analysis nonetheless makes quite clear that Kierkegaard and Hegel have completely different conceptions of ethics generally. While Hegel conceives of ethics as a part of science and thus as a specific abstract subject matter that displays the concept, Kierkegaard conceives of it in a much less academic sense as a kind of philosophy of life. This constitutes a fundamental difference between the two thinkers. In the postscript, Johannes Climacus paints a picture of speculative philosophy that represents the antithetic term to Christianity. Generations of readers have taken this to be a straightforward criticism of Hegel, but 301 AP 129, pap. 7-2b 235 p 251. 302 cup 1 p 242, SKS, Volume 7 p 220. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/CB09780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the 520 Hegel in the postscript. As has been seen, the matter is not so simple. The problem is that the picture, which is presented, corresponds very little to anything that can be found in Hegel's primary texts. Instead, Hegel's name seems to be used by Climacus merely as a symbol for what he perceives to be the cultural ills of the day. Climacus complains that the problem is not with speculative philosophy but with the entire age. It now became clear to me that the deviation of speculative thought and, based thereupon, its presumed right to reduce faith to a factor might not be something accidental, might be located far deeper in the orientation of the whole age, most likely in this, that because of much knowledge people have entirely forgotten what it means to exist and what inwardness is. 302 Here Climacus sounds like any of a number of the religious reformers who were active in Denmark at the time. This moralistic tone in Kierkegaard's works was noticed by contemporary readers. Martensen, for example, writes of Kierkegaard that in his criticism of the Danish Church, he addressed himself to the masses, he, who had earlier disdained the masses and had sought only a quiet encounter with the individual. His method differed in no way from that of the sects, that attack the established church because it is not in accord with what they call the Christianity of the New Testament. Similarly, Sibbern, also commenting on Kierkegaard's later attack on the church, says that he saw in Kierkegaard only a sectarian, whose attacks resemble those made by the Baptists and the Mormon preachers. The moralistic tone that Kierkegaard uses to criticize the Danish church is the same as that which Climacus uses to criticize the objective thinker. In both cases the charge concerns having a false relationship to Christianity. A part of this criticism is the Danish Hegelians and the cultural ills they represent. They seem generally to be regarded as embodying one of the gravest dangers to Christianity. Climacus presents a feigned build under the name of Hegel in order to attack it, but this is at best a self-consciously caricatured picture of Hegel produced by Climacus' own moral critique and seems to be the result of a number of complicated personal and biographical motivations. The personal or biographical dimension of the postscript has been overlooked in the literature, which would like to see the work as a straightforward criticism of Hegel. Kierkegaard never held a university position, and thus he could engage in a bitter tirade against the docents. He thought that Nielsen was unprepared to become a professor at the university, and the result was his consistent satire of Nielsen Sunist. 303 Hans Lassen Martensen, AFMIT Levnet, OPCIT, Volume 3 p. 17. Cited from Encounters with Kierkegaard, Tr. and ed. By Bruce H. Kerams, OPCIT, p. 203. 304 Letter F.C. Sibbern to Petronella Ross, March 26, 1855 in Breve till Og fra F.C. Sibbern. Ed. By C. L. Enminster, Volumes 1-2, Copenhagen, Gyldendal 1866, Volume 2 p. 224. Cited from Encounters with Kierkegaard, Tr. and ed. By Bruce H. Kerams, OPCIT, p. 104. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cb09780511498367013 downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the absence of an ethics in the system 521. System and constant promises. He thought that Martensen was unto court priest, and as a result Martensen is criticized under the headings speculative philosophy, the objective thinker, and the like. He resented Heiberg's dismissive comments about either /or and repetition, and as a result Heiberg is satirized as Dr. Jordespring for his over-enthusiastic pro-Hegel campaign. He thought that Grundtvig was affected and had a mistaken conception of Christianity, which neglected the individual, and as a result Grundtvig is constantly satirized for his preoccupation with world history. But all of this has nothing to do with Hegel. These various personal grudges and animosities are present in the postscript in an encoded form. While the unwary reader will associate the key code words immediately with Hegel, the true targets of Climacus' criticisms are almost invariably much closer to home. It would therefore be a mistake to overlook these biographical aspects. As Martensen says of his relation to Kierkegaard, no matter how much people talk in general about objectivity, about the principle of the thing, and about justice in connection with literary disputes and similar affairs, personal issues nonetheless play an important role, often in the narrowest way, and it is impossible to arrive at an adequate explanation without reference to them. Although, to be sure, a great deal of the postscript is ad hominem in character and thus of limited interest to anyone exploring the philosophical dimensions of the work, a number of the criticisms can be seen in a more positive light when they are regarded as moral critique in line with the ancient moralists. The arguments and criticisms of the moralists are in a sense ad hominem since they criticize moral vice in particular individuals, but the criticism is not just this in that it takes the individual as an example of a universal, i.e., for some general principle or tendency of the age. In this sense moral criticism makes use of particular individuals to make a legitimate philosophical point. Thus, to the extent that Kierkegaard uses the examples of Martensen, Heiberg, Grundtvig, and Nielsen to make a general point, his criticisms are not merely ad hominem. The criticisms of Martensen for claiming to have gone further than Hegel or for constantly repeating de omnibus dubitandum est are only ad hominem and cannot be universalized to a general philosophical point. By contrast, the criticism of him as an objective thinker who represents an objective approach to Christianity has genuine substantive content that transcends Martinson's person. These are the points one should focus on if one is interested in exploring the actual issues at stake. It will, however, be noted that these moral criticisms are not philosophical criticisms of Hegel. As the analysis presented here suggests, the problem 305 Hans Lassen Martinson, AFMIT LevNet, OPCIT, Volume 3 p. 13. Cited from Encounters with Kierkegaard, T.R., and ed. By Bruce H. Kerams, OPCIT, p. 201. Cambridge Books Online. Copyright Cambridge University Press, 2009. Cambridge Core Terms of Use, available at https://www.cambridge.org/core/terms. https://doi.org/1017/cb09780511498367013. Downloaded from https://www.cambridge.org/core. The Librarian Seeley Historical Library, on November 27, 2019 at 20 hours 20 minutes and 19 seconds, subject to the 522 Hegel in the postscript. Is not with Hegel's thought but with a certain moral disposition of the age, albeit in some vague sense indirectly enunced by Hegel, which leads to an inappropriate approach to Christianity. Thus, Climacus is not really in dialogue with Hegel directly and has no real complaint about the actual content of his philosophy. The long-standing perception that the postscript is Kierkegaard's great polemic with Hegel is in the null analysis nothing more than a myth based on an ahistorical understanding of the text. In this case Thulstrup is in a sense right but for the wrong reasons. It is true, as he says, that in this text Kierkegaard and Hegel have little in common, not because their thought is so disparate or fundamentally at odds, but rather because Kierkegaard argued against Hegel in name only and in fact his polemic was actually with Martinson, Heiberg, Grundtvig, and Nielsen. Generations of scholars have been thrown onto the wrong track by taking Climacus' rhetoric seriously when he seems to inveigh against Hegel. But, as has been seen, this is in fact nothing more than rhetorical guise motivated by personal animosities towards Martinson and the others, and very little by way of philosophical disagreement with Hegel stands behind it. It is regrettable that so many Kierkegaard commentators have focused on his rhetoric in this work without recognizing it as such. By so doing, they have failed to perceive the true target of the criticisms. After all of the passages that are concerned with Martinson, Heiberg, Grundtvig, or Nielsen have been extracted from the text, is there anything from Hegel that remains? I have tried to point out that there are issues in the text that are of more general philosophical interest, such as the problem of a beginning in philosophy, and thus while Climacus' target or interlocutor may well be Hegel, it may just as well be any number of other philosophers from the tradition. Moreover, in each of the passages that purportedly refer to Hegel, Climacus is invariably drawing on the discussion of Hegelianism in the Danish philosophical literature. In the null analysis, however, the positions that Climacus criticizes have little, if anything, to do with Hegel himself. Some of the discussions analyzed here reveal a meta-level dispute between Hegel and Kierkegaard. For example, their respective conceptions of ethics are quite disparate. For Hegel, ethics is a matter of the Sittlichkeit of a people, whereas for Kierkegaard it has something to do with the correct Christian disposition of the individual. Similarly, their discussions about faith are at cross purposes since Kierkegaard is concerned with the faith of the individual, whereas Hegel is concerned with the abstract notion of faith as one cognitive faculty among others. These discussions are indications of a disagreement at a much more general level than is usually assumed. The disagreement is not about some detail in Hegel's thought but rather with an entire conception of philosophy shared by Hegel and many others in the tradition. The postscript clearly marks the climax of what I have designated as the second period of Kierkegaard's authorship. The null work from this period, the book on Adler, can be regarded merely as a kind of addendum, at least with respect to the issue of Hegel's philosophy. There many of the same criticisms from the postscript are repeated without anything substantially new being added except for the fact that they are illustrated in the specific person of Adler. Thus, Kierkegaard shifts his target from Martensen to Adler. Both are accused of confusing Hegel's philosophy with Christianity and with the private faith of the individual. With the book on Adler, the second phase of Kierkegaard's relation to Hegel comes to a close. With it, the polemical disposition towards Hegel and above all Hegelians comes to an end, and Hegel's philosophy thereafter ceases to be thematized as an issue.